The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 776. Olga Nikolaevna, Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. It's late autumn, but it's still spring like all year round in Schönbrunn Palace, with flowers in full bloom. The leaves have begun to fall, but there is no sense of dilapidation and desolation. All kinds of strange animals roamed the meadows and artificial lakes of the palace, and snacks from all over the world were placed on an exquisite crystal table. Large-scale crystal products in this era are actually a reflection of a country's financial resources and strength. At this time, this giant crystal table weighing 2 tons is the best interpretation of waste. In addition to delicious food, there are also various books listed on the table, covering everything from literature, music, history, education, military, technology, and philosophy. Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna casually flipped through a few books while eating pizza. As the princess who has been with her parents for the longest time, the 24-year-old Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna rarely ushered in a rebellious period. I was urged to get married by my parents all day long, but the engagement was cancelled for no reason. Occasionally, she would be overly concerned by her brothers, led by Alexander, the unreliable eldest brother. Her brothers would kidnap a handsome boy back from time to time. They even offered her a bonus at the ball. Although her brothers had good intentions, Olga Nikolaevna really couldn't bear it. In particular, Crown Prince Alexander offered a reward of 10,000 rubles for his sister at a ball, causing the latter to be chased by all the dandies in St. Petersburg for a whole day. Afterwards, although Alexander was punished by a mixed doubles match by Nikolai and his wife and a 1-month grounding. The reputation of Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna for being unable to marry had already spread among the aristocratic circles. With Nicholas I protecting him, no one dared to say anything publicly, but pointing fingers behind his back was inevitable. It happened that Grand Duchess Sophie of the Austrian Empire sent an invitation to Queen Alexandra. Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna was very happy because she had a very good impression of the powerful Grand Duchess Sophie. Queen Alexandra and Grand Duchess Sophie are just two extremes. The former is too submissive and will hardly participate in any political affairs. She is not interested in charity and just wants to be a qualified housewife. The latter is just the opposite. Its evil reputation is already known to everyone from Spain to Russia. She almost emptied her husband's political power, just like Catherine the Great, and tried her best to build the personalities of her children in an attempt to push them to higher positions. Especially her eldest son even participated in 2 wars, but 100,000 against 3,000, 300,000 against 12,000. It would be difficult to lose with such a disparity in military strength. In fact, Mrs. Sophie also created characters for Maximilian and Ludwig, but this is quite complicated. However, Franz's character is even more outrageous, so people at home and abroad have long been accustomed to it. Mrs. Sophie's various behaviors have been criticized a lot, but Olga Nikolaevna admires this maverick strong woman very much. However, before coming to Austria, Nicholas I and Empress Alexandra strongly educated Olga Nikolaevna about the importance of this trip. That is the real purpose of this trip, a blind date. And the target of the blind date is the legendary Archduke Franz Joseph. It's just that the tragedy of her previous engagement made her a little resistant, and it would be too weird to go on a blind date with a boy 8 years younger than herself. But soon she learned of an even greater tragedy, that is, the failure of her marriage to the Crown Prince of Württemberg was due to a conspiracy between Grand Duchess Sophie and her parents. The purpose is to allow Russia and Austria to marry and consolidate the Holy Alliance. This will be beneficial to both Russia and Austria, and even the Württemberg royal family will get a good marriage. The only victims of the whole incident were herself and Archduke Franz Joseph, and Olga Nikolaevna wanted to refuse. However, her crying mother and stern and decisive father made her unable to handle it. They even carried out the last edict of Peter the Great. It seems that, as long as he does not marry Franz Joseph, war will begin tomorrow between Russia and Austria, and the ambitions of the Romanov dynasty will be shattered. Olga Nikolaevna had no choice but to follow her mother, Empress Alexandra, to Austria. However, after arriving in Austria, she discovered that it was a paradise compared to the snowy St. Petersburg. Especially in terms of food, drink and entertainment. There is almost everything you need. Austria and Russia both have strict censorship systems for books and newspapers, but the Austrian court does not prohibit members of the royal family from reading banned books. Opera and music are even different from Russia and Prussia. Delicate, soft and intoxicating. In terms of food, it is neither flashy like French food, nor too affordable. Relatively a bit rough, like Russian food. In fact, French cuisine had begun to become more conservative at this time. Although Napoleon lost, the French chefs did not. These people's arrogance and the recipes that had not changed for thousands of years had begun to make the top nobles tired. As for Russian food, to put it simply, it is big in size, strong in taste, monotonous in cooking methods, and lacks etiquette. Even the Russians themselves dismiss it. In contrast, Austrian cuisine at this time was much better. It was based on Italian and Czech cuisine, and mixed with the styles of many ethnic groups, giving people a dizzying feeling. In fact, this is also due to Franz. After all, his taste was quite strange in the eyes of people at the time. In order to cater to his taste, the chefs had to make some changes. Franz felt that as the capital of the Austrian Empire, Vienna would be biased, and a little too petty, if it only served Italian and Czech food to its visiting guests. Olga Nikolaevna and Empress Alexandra did not see Franz immediately after arriving in Vienna. So the two of them stayed in Schönbrunn Palace for a month. At first, Queen Alexandra would remind her daughter to be dignified. After all, Archduke Franz Joseph might be cured one day. Mother, when I first came to Vienna with my father, the eldest son of Archduke Karol lectured me on military theory for 3 days, and treated us to marching rations. After hearing her daughter's words, Queen Alexandra sighed helplessly. Hey, that's what men are like. That time when your father came back, he praised Austria's marching food for being delicious, and later he specially asked for the formula for your brothers to eat. Olga Nikolaevna curled her lips and continued talking about her previous experience in Vienna. The last time my father took me to Venice, Friedrich invited me on board the boat. I thought he was inviting me to watch the sunrise. As a result, he asked me if the boat was going fast. Can the cannon be fired? Just scrape some inexplicable creatures from the bottom of the boat and feed them to me. Queen Alexandra rubbed her eyebrows. Your father is obsessed with the Austrian battleships. There is also a barnacle. Your father said it tastes very good. Well, then, why doesn't he marry in Austria? Chapter 777. Olga Nikolaevna. Olga Nikolaevna said angrily, but Empress Alexandra only gave her daughter a loving slap on the back of her hand. You also have to see the good in others. Such a man will definitely be as hard to cheat as your father. Olga Nikolaevna was speechless for a while, but when she saw her sister-in-law being a widow, it was a life worse than death. But suddenly she thought of something fun. Mother, do you think that Franz Joseph is not known as a born saint? Will he take out a Bible this time? Skin. Queen Alexandra tapped her daughter's forehead. She began to worry about her daughter's future. After all, the old girl was too careful and might not meet the standards of being a queen. At that time, European courts generally believed that women who were submissive and lacked independent opinions were more suitable to be queens or queens. But as time went by, Queen Alexandra didn't bother to care anymore, because the days in Schönbrunn Palace were really too lazy. Suitable temperature, comfortable life, delicious food, beautiful scenery, soothing music, and carefree days are intoxicating. Olga Nikolaevna simply didn't even tie her hair up, and she just let her waterfall-like hair hang loosely on her shoulders. He casually picked up a piece of pizza with his hands, flipped through the pages of the book with his slender fingers, and then when the waiter wasn't paying attention, he threw the remaining pizza aside to the great orc who had been waiting for a long time. In fact, nobles usually eat pizza with a knife and fork, but when Olga Nikolaevna arrived, She saw Franz's sister Maria eating pizza with her hands, so the Russian princess was led astray, but it was really easy to do. So point in fact, Olga Nikolaevna met Franz's two younger brothers. One was a self-righteous fool, and the other was a big fool who had the word stupid carved on his forehead. Point according to the analogy analysis method, she felt that Franz was probably a playboy with high ambitions and low abilities like her elder brother. But based on the rumors, he might be the kind of boring man. Olga Nikolaevna was completely dissatisfied with this marriage, but Vienna was a nice city, and she liked it very much. Olga Nikolaevna felt that she should find a way to stay in Vienna and investigate for a while. The Royal College for Women that little sister Maria said looked good. If his father asked him, he could just explain that it was to obtain advanced Western knowledge. Olga Nikolaevna felt that she was a genius and couldn't help but snicker to herself. The waiters at Schönbrunn Palace were already used to the various strange behaviors of this Russian princess. After all, Russians are barbarians, and it is normal for them to do anything disrespectful. Moreover, Mrs. Sophie has issued strict orders. Anyone who is disrespectful to the princess and queen may be dragged to fill the river embankment. No one dared to test whether Mrs. Sophie's words were true or false, so naturally no one dared to make fun of Princess Olga. Just when Princess Olga was complacent about her genius idea, bad news came that Archduke Franz Joseph had recovered from his illness. Although both parties knew that this was a blind date, the royal family still had to save face. Fixed pomp and ceremony must be in place, and in addition there must be a valid reason. So the Habsburg royal family decided to hold another reception banquet for the Russian queen and princess who had been living in Schönbrunn Palace for a month. The formal palace reception is followed by a dinner and a dance, where the young people can mingle. Of course, the atmosphere team is indispensable for this kind of thing. As a result, unmarried men and women from Vienna's upper class were invited, but these people were carefully selected to set off Franz and Princess Olga. During the reception ceremony, Franz met Princess Olga for the first time. She was tall, plump, and had a pretty face, but it seemed a bit rude to stare straight at him. In fact, European courts were very tolerant of Russians, because they were by default barbarians. Princess Olga's eyes were full of surprise. She didn't expect the two crooked brothers to be so handsome, tall and handsome, with a tall and straight posture, and a majestic and solemn temperament that made people's hearts tremble. Just one glance made Princess Olga feel special. In fact, Franz's appearance was still outstanding, and years of physical training and temperament training made him even more outstanding. Generally speaking, young handsome guys are very thin, but Franz is different from his tall and straight body, and his strong muscles can fully support the military uniform he is wearing. Princess Olga felt a little bit PTSD when she saw the military uniforms. She wondered what she should do if such a handsome boy talked to her about military issues. It was said that Archduke Franz Joseph's favorite thing was to dig trenches and build embankments. Princess Olga tried hard to recall the military books she had read, looking for an image that matched him. It's an engineer, Queen. Alexandra glared at her daughter, who hurriedly broke away from her fantasy and put on a trademark fake smile. Dinner. Almost all Vienna's socialites, senior military and political officials, and royal family members participated. The huge crystal chandelier illuminated the entire venue brightly, and men and women in luxurious clothes gathered together. But the trouble was that Franz and Olga had to accept the greetings of the guests in the center of the hall. Some people will also ask specific questions, but most of them are polite and have a fixed answer pattern. According to etiquette, Franz and Olga had to accept greetings and gifts from everyone like two mascots and answer every question politely to show their self-cultivation. The requirements for women in this era are usually lower, because basically any question can be answered with "I don't know," while men have to answer "I'm sorry. Please ask my consultant or housekeeper." However, Franz's performance surprised Princess Olga. He did not show off like his elder brother Alexander, but answered almost every visitor's question, including many well-known scholars and masters. This makes Princess Olga feel a little unbelievable, but considering that this is Austrian territory, it is not surprising that the two sides have colluded. So Princess Olga had a sudden idea and decided to deal with this hypocrite, but she found that she was just like a fool. On the other hand, Franz was very depressed. Didn't Mrs. Sophie say that Princess Olga was as docile as a sheep? The former looked at the latter, who was staring at the former fiercely, as if to say, it's not your fault, Franz. Thought about it, and it was right. After all, it was normal to feel a little resentful after letting someone go for a month. However, what he didn't know was how much fun the other party had in Vienna. After the mascot work was over, Franz and Olga could finally sit down at the table and have a nice meal. Fine wine and delicious food cannot offset Princess Olga's doubts about Franz, because the latter's knowledge can no longer be described as erudite. He is simply a monster. Chapter 778 Dance. Queen Alexandra was very satisfied with Franz. She had been afraid that the painter of the Austrian royal family would paint people too handsome, and it would be bad if Olga fell too far behind after seeing him. But fortunately, Franz spoke better than Mrs. Sophie, and from what she saw in Vienna these days, even if she didn't understand politics, she knew that the country's national strength was far from what it used to be. Even Nicholas I would feel heartbroken to receive a grand princess with such high standards, and judging from the performance of the guests, the standards were indeed very high, but not unique. In other words, there are often banquets of similar standards in Vienna. For Queen Alexandra, the wealth of the Habsburg family meant that her daughter would not suffer hardship when she married, and the strength of Austria meant that the alliance was stable, so there was no need to worry about the two countries going to war. Mrs. Sophie was also very satisfied. She felt that marriage with Russia was Austria's best choice at this time. The remaining countries are not worth mentioning at all, and the princes of Germany and Italy cannot continue to increase their influence and provide political resources for the Austrian Empire. The only one with strategic value is Prussia, but the other party's interest does not seem to be great, so the priority can only be lowered. As for Spain, it is too far away for Austria, and the former has already entered into a marriage plan with the French. It is not easy to seize the opportunity from the tiger's mouth. Empires such as Brazil and Mexico, which are not recognized at all, are even less likely to be considered. To sum up, Mrs. Sophie is very satisfied with this marriage. After all, Princess Olga looks very healthy. As for her personality, she was a pretty normal child before. The problem is probably with Franz. No matter what, she is still a princess of a big country. If she really doesn't work, she can be trained slowly. My dear, what do you think of Princess Olga, madam? Sophie suddenly wanted to ask her husband's opinion. Archduke Franz Karol quickly stuffed all the food on the plate into his mouth, poured another sip of wine and spoke vaguely. Eatable, drinkable, clean, white, and tall. Mrs. Sophie held her forehead. She regretted her behavior just now. I'm asking what you think. Of course I sat and watched. The party is not over yet, Archduke. Franz Karol kindly reminded him, and Mrs. Sophie could only say helplessly, eat vegetables. Eat vegetables. This is the dividing line that must be eaten after dinner, before the dance begins. Franz doesn't like being stared at, but he's gotten used to it over the years, and doesn't show much emotion when faced with burning eyes. Beautiful Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna, if you have any questions, you'd better ask them now, otherwise you may not have the chance later, dear. Archduke Franz Joseph, are you giving me an ultimatum, princess? Olga showed a charming smile, and then prepared to leave gracefully. No, I'm just reminding you in a friendly way. Franz did not chase him, nor did he give any explanation in a panic. A kind reminder made Princess Olga very angry. She felt that the other party must be provoking. The former sighed helplessly as he watched the latter's leaving figure. However, he did not take any further action. Instead, he chose to recuperate his energy. After all, there was still some physical work ahead. After the two separated, the atmosphere became a little awkward. After all, this series of activities was specially prepared for these two young people. Flowers, wine, dances, and waltzes are the favorites of young people in this era. In order to increase the atmosphere, Mrs. Sophie also invited the old Johann Strauss, known as the King of Waltz, but his edge was obscured by too many big names present. Although I don't know what the situation will be, the dance must go on. Queen Alexandra on the other hand is not in a hurry, because she knows that her daughter is actually very well educated, and she will politely refuse, even if she doesn't like it. What's more, unlike other German princes, Austria is an ally that can be on an equal footing with the Russian Empire. Olga will not be so ignorant. The current situation is entirely because the other party is not paying enough attention to her and is getting angry. This shows that Olga is very interested in Franz. So Queen Alexandra quietly made a gesture to reassure Madame Sophie, who then breathed a sigh of relief. She was really afraid that there would be trouble if the two children couldn't get along. Queen Alexandra saw Princess Olga coming over and asked her to sit next to her and said, "My dear little Olga, how do you feel? Have a great time at the dance, Mom. Can you remove that small print? I'm 24 years old." Olga scolded, but Queen Alexandra didn't care and stroked her daughter's head lovingly. "Olga, my little Olga, there are not many opportunities for a woman to make choices in her life, so take advantage of it. Mother, if you don't like it, I can take you away now, princess." Olga was startled by the sudden change in Queen Alexandra's tone, but when she saw the smile in her mother's eyes, she couldn't help but hold her mother's hand and start acting coquettishly. "Mom, how could you do this? I'm your biological daughter. I don't understand him yet, Queen." Alexandra tapped Princess Olga on the forehead. Then, "What's the point of holding my hand? Ask yourself. He's right there, princess." Olga struggled for a while before she mustered up the courage to walk to Franz. However, before the former could speak, he noticed that the drum music suddenly changed, followed by Franz's outstretched hand. "Princess Olga, can I ask you to dance?" Franz's eyes were clear and bright, and his smile was elegant and confident. Olga nodded subconsciously and stretched out her hand. Then the latter lost his body autonomy. Franz danced very fast, but at a pace that Princess Olga could just keep up with. In fact, the drumbeat of the music, the focus of the lights, and everyone's gazes all changed at that moment. Only Franz and Olga were dancing in the center of the whole point, but Olga couldn't notice any other changes at this time. She only knew that her heart was beating violently and her body was constantly catching up with the opponent's movements. The boy, who was 8 years younger than her, was now like a comparison. She accommodated her like an older gentleman. Their dance steps became more and more coordinated, and Olga also put away her embarrassment of the little deer bumping into each other. She tried her best to appear elegant and confident. People at the ball cast envious glances one after another, attracted by the elegance and beauty of the pair of dancers. The applause and drumbeats sounded in time, making Olga become more confident and couldn't help but smile. She looked at him, and there seemed to be something fiercely fighting between their eyes. After the dance, there was thunderous applause, and the ones who clapped the loudest were Prince Metternich and the Russian ambassador to Austria, Mr. Plavich. Franz smiled and said, "Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna, you are such an excellent dancer. I'm honored to dance with you." "Me too. If you could, I'd like you to call me Olga." "Okay, then. Olga, my name is Franz. It's nice to meet you again." "Me too. See you next time." "Wait a moment. One good thing about Russian women is that they are not pretentious." Olga put her arms around Franz's neck, stood up on tiptoes, and kissed him gently. Chapter 779 3-year agreement. The previous blind date was so successful that Mrs. Sophie decided to strike while the iron was hot and settle their marriage beforehand. Franz thought that was not bad. After all, it was not a bad thing after the relationship with the Russians became public. On the contrary, it can deter to a certain extent those young people who want to sow relations between the two countries, and at the same time, it can also make other powers avoid threatening either Russia or Austria. In fact, if you want to win the Crimean War, no matter how much supplies Austria provides to Russia, it is not as practical as the Russians building a railway to Crimea themselves. There is a joke in this war, that is, the transportation cost for the Russians on their own land is higher than the cost for the British and French coalition forces across the ocean. After the marriage between the two countries, Franz can micromanage the future layout to a certain extent. But Franz didn't want to get married too early because 1848 was coming. soon, and Austria would become very unsafe and there would be a lot of uncertainty. Franz did not want to increase the possibility of an accident, so he felt that the wedding should be postponed as much as possible. Franz, what are you thinking about? It's normal to get engaged this year and get married next year. What the hell is a 3-year date? Mrs. Sophie was furious. She didn't know what Franz was thinking, but it would be troublesome if the Russians thought this was humiliating them. Mother, I think it's too early to get married. Besides, there are still many hidden dangers in the country. Why are you so early? Others have sons as old as you. Even if the sky falls, it won't be your turn to bear the burden. Let's get married first and talk about anything later. No, mother. Believe me, our situation is not safe. Austria's rapid development has affected the survival of the Hungarian government. They are unwilling to give up their privileges and embrace the new era. Sooner or later there will be a war between us. The attitude of the Hungarian people is becoming more and more arrogant, and Mrs. Sophie is very aware of it. But those radical incidents all broke out in Hungary. At least so far they have not affected Austria. Moreover, everything in the Austrian Empire was developing at a high speed at this time, and even if there was a real fight, the Hungarians would have no chance of winning. Then, you should get married as soon as possible. Then we can also use the power of the Russian Empire to help us attack the Hungarians from both sides. Mother, that is definitely not a good idea. The Romanov family will not give up their ambitions just because the other party is their in-law. Moreover, the most difficult thing in the world to repay is a debt of gratitude. You don't want people to say one day that our Habsburg family repays kindness with hatred, right? Mrs. Sophie became more and more confused as she listened, but she had a bad feeling that her son was planning some big plan. Thinking about it carefully, it seemed that 7 or 8 years ago, Franz had foreseen everything today. She didn't want to admit it, but she did give birth to an incredible monster. Franz, I don't know what you are thinking, but you are not the only one in the history of the Habsburg family who is ambitious and difficult to understand. But what happened to them? Frederick III had to live in isolation, and Joseph II died. I don't want you to join in for the entertainment of future generations. Franz naturally understood Mrs. Sophie's intentions, but he couldn't tell the truth, because it was all too sensational. Mother, doesn't the Archbishop always say that I'm a born saint? I will succeed, whether you will succeed or not. First tell me how to stabilize the Tsar's family and make the 24-year-old girl wait for you for 3 years. I don't know how to say it. If you are too old to have children, don't think about using an illegitimate child to inherit the throne. Do you understand? Mrs. Sophie was very dissatisfied. She still hoped that Franz could get married as soon as possible to avoid long nights and dreams. In fact, after the latter learned about the history of the Habsburg family, he really didn't care much about whether his descendants could inherit the throne. After all, there was no particularly sensational incident of fratricide in this family. As for having no descendants, it would be nice. After all, the path Franz is going to take is very hated by people. Naturally, no one dares to do anything when he is alive, but that may not be the case after his death. It's a relief to be free from worries. In fact, Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna had no children in history, but Franz did not know it, because this princess was not famous in history. It's actually easy to stabilize the Tsar's family. Nicholas I was so proactive because he saw the benefits that would come from marrying Austria, so we can give the betrothal gift first. I would like to see what kind of gold and silver can stop the Tsar's mouth. A railway from Moscow to the Sevastopol fortress. 3 new steel battleships. What about Olga? She'll be willing to wait. Why? A poem. Russia. St. Petersburg. Nicholas I paced back and forth in his office. Sometimes he wanted to shout excitedly, and sometimes he was tearing his hair and not knowing what to do. Because the gift sent by the Austrians was too precious, and it happened to be what Russia needed most urgently. Although the railways and battleships were not in his hands, they gave the entire country hope. Russia's finances have always been very tight, and the cost of building railways for the Russians is much higher than that of other European countries, almost 10 times that of Austria. As for the battleships, the Austrian battleships are probably not as good as the British, but they are still armored battleships, and are worth looking forward to. Note: At this time, Russia did not have the ability to produce ironclad warships. Even during the Crimean War, they were unable to manufacture large-scale ironclad warships. The marriage between the two countries will also facilitate the further expansion of trade. Once Franz becomes the emperor of the Austrian Empire, Russia's economy will inevitably improve. It's just that all this comes at the expense of his daughter's happiness. Nicholas I civilized future generations with cruelty, but he was unwilling to rise in such a way. Nicholas I couldn't figure out why Austria set the wedding date 3 years later. The reason given by the Austrian side was that the body and mind were still immature and needed experience. If this sentence were applied to the brothers Ferdinand I and Franz Karl, it would not feel inconsistent. But isn't this generation of Habsburg family full of talents? Albrecht, Friedrich, and the collateral lineage Ambrosius were all outstanding talents, and Mrs. Sophie's 4 sons were even more extraordinary. Ranging from saints to unparalleled geniuses. Suddenly Nicholas I thought of something. Albrecht and Friedrich were an army genius and a naval genius, but the two were comparable to idiots in terms of human sophistication. Albrecht was still unmarried at his age, and he always taught people about science and military matters during every blind date. Friedrich is said to have snatched an Arab as his wife, and has now become a joke among the aristocracy. If the latter's father had not been Archduke Karol, he would have been expelled from the family, or executed with honor long ago. The same is true of Ambrosius. Judging from this situation, Mrs. Sophie's sons may not fare much better. Chapter 780 Statistics. In St. Petersburg, in another room of the Winter Palace, Princess Olga was reciting the love poem sent by Franz repeatedly, waiting for the clouds after a rain, waiting for the brightest star, waiting for you and I to meet again. Latin. Although the content is obscure, Princess Olga has figured out a lot of reasons why Franz had to do this. In fact, it is shameful to say that as the daughter of the Russian Tsar, the 24-year-old has yet to receive a true love letter. Most of the love letters Olga received before were written by her brothers to tease her, and even if they were true, she would burn them as pranks. Only Queen Alexandra is worried because her daughter will be 27 years old in 3 years, which is almost unheard of for an old girl in the royal family. But her daughter was happy, her husband was ecstatic holding those iron lumps, and her sons were jumping around like monkeys. She had no choice but to hope that everything would go well. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. The statistical report of the Battle of Galicia is out. This includes important data such as battle damage on both sides, property losses, the number of people killed by the Polish Restoration Army, and the number of nobles who conspired with the Polish Restoration Army. The total number of civilian casualties in Galicia and the newly naturalized Krakow region exceeded 100,000, the vast majority of whom were serfs, and the rest were mainly Krakow citizens who refused to be coerced, including the former mayor of Krakow and 19 MPs. During the entire Battle of Galicia, there were more than 1,300 casualties among the garrison, gendarmes, police, and militiamen. Among them, all 150 garrison members of the Calvaria fortress were brutally killed. 51 police officers and 249 government officials died in the line of duty in Krakow. The Austrian Empire posthumously awarded them medals of honor and granted pensions in accordance with domestic standards at the same level. This kind of behavior is actually like buying horse bones for thousands of dollars. These relatives of officials in Krakow don't know when their deceased relatives became officials in Austria. But they had just escaped from death and naturally could not refuse this wealth that fell from the sky. This money was not only to appease the old forces, but also to set an example for the new forces in the city, making them understand the benefits of obedience and the cost of resistance. After discussion, the senior officials of the Austrian Empire decided not to take back the status of the free city of Krakow. In fact, this was a helpless move. After all, it was not good to openly violate the rules and regulations of the German customs union. Moreover, a free city under Austrian control is more valuable than a ruin that has lost its status as a transportation and commercial hub. In this battle, the Austrian Imperial Expeditionary Force suffered 173 casualties, killed 4,788 foreign separatist forces. and captured 25,674 people. However, according to the custom of this era, except for the 3 heinous criminals who were hanged under an order personally signed by Ferdinand I, the others were sentenced to hard labor and exile. Fortunately, France solved some troubles through public trials in advance, otherwise those people might not get the punishment they deserve at all. Of course, the so-called public trials cannot be made public, so those things can only be done by the people on their own initiative, and the Austrian army cannot stop it. That's all. In fact, the scale of hard labor and exile in the Austrian Empire was very broad. Hard labor can range from mowing lawns in Vienna's parks to digging coal in mines. The amount of labor and the degree of danger are vastly different. Similarly, exile can go to international metropolises such as Paris, Vienna, and London, or to resorts such as the beaches of Venice or the snow-capped mountains of the Alps, or even to the tropical rainforests of the Congo, the no-man's land of Dalmatia, or the vast expanses of Namibia. The desert is a restricted area of life. As for the verdict, it all depends on the judge and the higher-ups. Naturally, Franz doesn't want to face a group of invincible bullies all day long. Even if 10 years of mining life cannot physically eliminate those rebels, their ambitions will probably be buried deep underground. However, exiling people directly to death is a bit cruel and wasteful. Filling up the colonial settlements in the interior of Africa may be a good choice. These colonial settlements, that go deep into the inland, can be said to be dragons and tigers' dens. The mortality rate of more than 10% every year is normal, and some are even taken away by floods, plagues, earthquakes, and waves of indigenous people. At this time, the pioneer life in the interior of Africa was like this. It was still farming, hunting, and beating up the natives, but the level of danger was more than 10 times higher. These settlements, that go deep into the interior, often do not even have rudimentary production capabilities. They have to start from scratch to survive in the wilderness. Almost all tools and weapons come from limited supplies. The supply team often only comes once every few months. The same problem may not be a problem in the mainland. It is just a minor trouble in the coastal settlements, but it is a fatal matter in these frontline settlements. Venomous insects and ferocious beasts are almost everywhere in the jungle, and they are even more difficult to find and deadly in the coastal plains. At the same time, these areas are also paradises for diseases and bacteria. Even if fire destroys the vegetation near settlements, new spores will soon be carried by the wind. The indigenous people were not much of a threat in the coastal areas. The number of colonists was almost more than 100 and all problems could be solved. The exchange ratio between the two sides was usually above 1:10, and the colonists were almost invincible. But in the jungle, it is a completely different situation. Aboriginal people acting alone or in small groups are more difficult to deal with than a coalition of several large indigenous tribes. Moreover, the indigenous people living in the jungle usually refused to communicate, and the colonists were unable to communicate with them. The indigenous people only regarded the pioneers as a dangerous food. As for plowing and clearing holes like in coastal areas, it is almost impossible because the jungle terrain is complex and there are primitive traps in swamps, mire, and ground cracks. They may swallow human lives at any time, and it is almost impossible to pursue them continuously. Impossible. Franz felt that those Polish resurgents probably had no intention of starting a rebellion in a place like this, and as long as they wanted to survive, they had to rely on the Austrian supply team, and they needed Austrian ships if they wanted to return to Europe. Of course, Franz never fails to give people hope. These people can also end their exile as long as they serve for 10 years. If they perform major meritorious services, their sentences can be reduced, and they can even become officials and make a fortune. At the same time, all their food and clothing expenses will be counted. New sentence. But all of this is based on the premise that they can survive. If they can't survive, this is just a painting. Even more difficult to deal with than these prisoners were those Polish nobles who may have been seduced into rebellion, although Franz had used various methods to deal with a large number of them before. The serfs were not professional butchers after all. In fact, they left a lot of legacy. According to tradition, the Austrian government cannot do anything to them. After all, everyone is a noble. Although the Polish aristocracy had its own circle, and usually did not mix with the original Austrian aristocratic circle, there were inevitably a few exceptions. It's the end of the month. Please vote for me. Chapter 781 Difficult Things to Do. So under the instigation of this group of people, the Austrian aristocratic circle started a political show that pitted the rabbit against the fox. They first donated money and materials to hold a charity ball, and then launched a collective petition. If this happened in the east, or even a little bit east, these people would be dead. However, it happened in the Austrian Empire, so the government had to consider a solution. However, the Regent Council also knew very well that these people were the cause of the rebellion in Galicia, and it was impossible to let them back. It would also be troublesome to stay in Vienna. What if these guys couldn't get over it and revolted again one day? In fact, even if they wanted to send them back to Galicia, their land deeds and the serfs' deeds of sale were burned by Franz, and even the final backup was gone. However, regarding the matter of Franz burning the contract, the empire's senior officials had no objections. After all, from any perspective, the Poles should not be allowed to continue to dominate Galicia. Moreover, they were also the actual beneficiaries of the establishment of the royal estate. Although everyone knew it, the blame still fell on the Galician serfs and the Polish Restoration Army. The Regency Council initially planned to bring the Polish nobles to the colony to continue being their landlords. After all, according to Franz, the colony had plenty of land. However, it was strongly opposed by Franz, because at this time the upper class society in each colony was dominated by German-speaking peoples. This system took Franz a lot of effort to carefully select. If a large number of Polish landowners were suddenly inserted, although all previous efforts would not be wasted, it would only cause a lot of trouble. After all, the native people and workers in the colony couldn't tell the difference between Germans and Poles. In their eyes, white people were all the same. If the lower class chose the Poles, wouldn't Franz be making a wedding dress for others? Franz did not want this possibility, even if it was 1%, so he firmly opposed sending those Polish nobles to the colonies to continue to be masters. In fact, Prince Metternich felt that if the Poles could be allowed to establish a country in the colonies, would that be able to fundamentally solve the problem of Polish Zionism. As soon as this sentence came out, he was immediately strongly opposed by Count Korolov. "You are a naked traitor. At this time, the Poles have not stabilized the country and can cause so much harm to our country. If this group of people is really given a country, will they unite with other countries to counterattack us? What if other ethnic groups in our country plan to do the same? Don't we want every ethnic group to be given a piece of land? Feeding tigers with one's body and feeding eagles with one's body does no good to anyone, except to impress oneself. I firmly object, and if you insist, I propose that your family fiefdom be given to the Poles." Prince Metternich was furious as soon as he said this. However, Count Karlarov was not the only one who opposed this matter. The military also strongly opposed this matter. Count Latter, "I object. Just because the losers did not get the punishment they deserved, just like the French after Waterloo, they did not suffer the punishment they deserved, so the French challenged our country again and again. Bottom line point, I think this is intolerable. Losing land is the minimum punishment for the Poles. They should thank us for not hanging them." Although Prince Metternich was angry, there was always a palace. I just raised a possibility. Since everyone disagrees, we can continue the discussion. I also want to hear your suggestions, Prince. Metternich was digging a hole, but Count Latter did not want to be laughed at as a coward. "I think the Poles should be sent to the colonies. I heard that the East African colonies are as big as 3 or 4 France, and giving them a small piece of land is not a big deal. And bringing them together makes it easier for the empire to monitor and manage them. Do you know how many people are needed to monitor 10,000 square kilometers of land? And there is a constant war in East Africa. What should we do if this group of Poles defect to the indigenous people? Shouldn't we send our heroic Imperial army thousands of miles away to destroy them? Or the kind of third-rate troops that pin their hopes on the colonies? The Poles may be vulnerable to the regular army of the Austrian Empire, but they still act like overlords in the colonies. The army of farmers, sailors, and mercenaries in the colonies is not necessarily their opponent. Metternich's words immediately made the brave general lose his temper. In addition, he mentioned that Count Latter was loyal, brave, and self-disciplined, but he was not an excellent war minister. Count Korolov said, "Actually, it doesn't have to be so troublesome. I have a way to deal with these Poles once and for all without sacrificing our precious territory. Franz was also present, and he wanted to hear this advice. Since he has reached adulthood, Franz can already participate in important meetings, called studying government affairs. Your Majesty, please speak directly, dear Franz, Prime Minister. Our country's economic situation is now good, and we can use money to solve problems. Give them a sum of money and let them live in other countries. This will not only save our land, but also throw this trouble to other countries. Prussia in the north had 150,000 troops stationed on the border. I think they probably wanted to wait until we and the Poles suffered a loss, and then come back to benefit. Count Korolov's analysis was reasonable and well-founded, and Count Latter nodded repeatedly. Yes. Send those Poles to Prussia to seize their land. Prince Metternich couldn't help but smile. Count Latter, why are you laughing, Prince Metternich? I just thought of something funny. What if the Poles and the Prussians really colluded? Then wouldn't we be siding with the enemy? Even if the Poles and the Prussians did not collude, if the Poles went to Prussia to buy land, it would be a win-win for them, because the former got the capital to make a comeback, and the latter got the money. Then taking a step back, is it right to use our money to compensate our enemies? This was hours of wrangling. A few hours later, the elderly Archduke Louis had fallen asleep, and Archduke Franz Karol had already whittled 4 wooden carvings with a knife. Franz Joseph beside him felt his scalp numb. At first Franz wanted to hear how long these people could discuss, but he still underestimated this group of 19th century politicians. The 3 people talked from morning to evening, but they still couldn't reach an agreement. The most terrifying thing was that they were not just talking, but really discussed all the possibilities. In the end, Franz had no choice but to give out the advice he had thought of all along. I thought we could send them to Dalmatia and use the land there to compensate them. Dalmatia was considered the most desolate region in the Austrian Empire at this time, and it still had a smaller population than it had during the ancient Roman period. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 782 Dalmatia. Dalmatia was considered the most desolate region in the Austrian Empire at this time, and it still had a smaller population than it had during the ancient Roman period. Dalmatia was not one of the most desolate provinces in the Austrian Empire, not even the newly conquered mountainous areas in the east. It covers an area of 13,000 kilometers, and has a population of less than 100,000 at this time. During the ancient Roman period, the local population once numbered hundreds of thousands, but no one thought that this would be the local peak point in the following thousands of years. Wars continued in Dalmatia, and various conquerors came one after another. War, massacre, and famine almost became the norm. The population size in 2023 will be approximately 730,000. Dalmatia has the second lowest literacy rate in the country and the lowest tax contribution rate in the country. But this does not mean that this land is worthless. In fact, Dalmatia has a precious coastline and the land is relatively fertile. Otherwise, it would not have been able to support so many people during the ancient Roman period. The local climate is warm and the sunshine is abundant, which is very suitable for the growth of economic crops such as olives, grapes, and tobacco. However, locals prefer hunting and sheep herding because this property is easily transferable. The Austrian Empire once wanted to use Slovenians and Croatians to develop this land, but they were relatively backward peoples, and their development methods were to herd sheep and raise donkeys, but they still had no results. After decades, Franz felt that the Poles could be allowed to develop this land. After all, people from other parts of Austria did not like to live in this desolate land. After the locals see these outsiders getting rich, they should choose to follow suit, and the Austrian government can revitalize the entire region if it intervenes appropriately. In fact, there is no need to worry about the Poles becoming bigger, because although Dalmatia's coastline is long, it lacks truly excellent ports and the upper limit of local agriculture. and animal husbandry is not high, and it lacks industrial production capacity. Point in Franz's plan, Dalmatia should be built as a tourist resort focusing on agriculture and animal husbandry. Point the Dalmatian region is actually quite dependent on the Austrian Empire's market and all products, except agricultural and sideline products. The thousands of Polish nobles are unable to have much practical impact on local society. Point. If there is a pro-Polish tendency in the local area, then continue to mix in the sand and beat the leading bird. If it doesn't work, you can continue to vacate the cage and replace the bird. Point. Everyone in the Regent Council had no objections to Franz's proposal because the land in Dalmatia was naturally less fertile than Galicia, and the area was mountainous and swampy. These badlands gave the Austrian government a lot of control space. Point. In fact, everyone knew that the Austrian nobles were concerned about their own interests, not the life and death of the Poles. As long as the overall plan is acceptable in form, it doesn't matter what happens in the future. Point. At the same time, both Count Korolaf and Metternich knew that Franz would become emperor in the future, and this future was not far away. Point. To oppose Franz at this time is to submit your resignation in advance, but the old foxes will not do it too obviously. Point. The two made some minor repairs to Franz's plan, and at the same time, put forward some relatively feasible suggestions, based on their own experience, allowing Franz to discover it on his own. Point. Although Franz has been in this world for more than 10 years, his understanding of the country is still not as good as the two old men who have been in business for decades. For example, how to monitor the movements of these thousands of Poles, and how to segment them to prevent them from connecting with each other to form new interest groups. In fact, the simplest thing is to divide it by parish, and the priests are the best supervisors. There are usually conflicts between different parishes in the lower society. These small parishes are usually small interest groups. It is impossible for priests to tolerate their believers, herds, going to other parishes to join forces. This situation is more serious in poorer places. In addition to using religion, the government could not stand idly by. At this time, the Austrian Empire was relatively rich in funds. They also planned to take advantage of the famine after the locust plague to move another group of Italians, because there were too many Italians in Austria. Point. At the same time, the scale of local government will be expanded by another 50%, which will also solve the unemployment problem of college students piling up on the streets of Vienna. Point. College students are indeed very valuable in this era, but official positions in the Austrian Empire are even more scarce. This is not because the total number of official positions in the Austrian Empire is small. Point, but due to the traditional system of conferring officials in the aristocratic clans that have accumulated for hundreds of years. They have occupied the vast majority of official positions, and there are not many positions available for newcomers. Franz had previously recruited support teachers, as well as colonial managers and administrators. This kind of secondary civil servants was also to solve the employment problem of college students in the Austrian Empire. Point. It is difficult for these highly educated people to accept simple and dull manual labor, and they even despise jobs such as bookkeepers and accountants. However, we cannot do without them if we want the stability and sustainable development of this society. The era of obscurantist policies that simply restricted the spread of knowledge has passed. The quality of citizens has become an important indicator of a country's strength. Point. It's just that this indicator has not been accepted by all countries at this time, and some countries are already benefiting without knowing it. Point. So far, the senior officials of the Austrian Empire have no objections to Franz's increase in the number of civil servants in the empire, because he only added low-level clerks and non-staff personnel, and did not touch the interests of the upper class. Moreover, for senior officials, increasing manpower will not only improve government efficiency, but also increase the power in their hands, so there is no reason to object. Point. As for government spending, this is not an issue they need to consider. In contrast, it is troublesome for some nobles to be jealous. Fortunately, Franz also increased the number of jobs for the nobles in disguise. Point. Generally speaking, all classes in the country are quite satisfied. However, Franz knew very well that this infinitely expanding game could not be played forever. This is a lengthy imperial government announcement. In fact, this announcement is thankless, because no matter how it is handled, some people will be dissatisfied. First of all, there are the Polish nobles who are being held hostage. It is useless, even if you give Vienna to them. Secondly, there are the soldiers who shed blood on the front lines and the ordinary people who transport supplies behind. Their simple concept of justice makes them feel that the evildoers have not received the punishment they deserve. The traditional nobles of the empire didn't actually care about the life and death of the Polish nobles. They just wanted to prove that they still had the power to influence national policy and ensure that the power of the royal family and the government would not be too great. In this feast of performances, not only the nobles resident in Vienna, but also nobles from all over the country and all nationalities came to put pressure on the government, and even the Hungarians participated. Their only purpose is to roast the royal family on the fire. This is to ensure that the royal family will stand on a united front with them. They have no burden for this. After all, they have been doing this for thousands of years, allowing the royal family to trample on the law and public opinion, so they can only rely on them. But Franz was not prepared to accompany them in playing this little game that had lasted for thousands of years, and of course he had no such idea in the whole old era. Chapter 783 Decision. So word games became a necessary means. In fact, Franz found a lot of legal experts and linguists to work together on this matter. However, Prince Metternich still saw the clues at a glance. Archduke Franz, do this. He pondered for a while and said, actually, there's nothing wrong with it. But it's better to borrow the help of the Regent Council. After all, there are some people who don't know how to adapt and are willing to jump over the wall. Count Korolov also saw the problem at this time. He also hesitated for a while, but this time he did not go against Prince Metternich. Archduke Franz, I understand how you feel. After all, you have been under the pressure of revitalizing the empire and the title of born saint since you were a child. But isn't reform something that should only be done after being in desperate situations? Now that the empire's fortunes are booming, you have plenty of ways to achieve your goals. So why do you need to adopt this most radical strategy? I hate those guys who are always trying to engage in moral kidnapping as much as you do, but I still recommend that you do these things someday in the future. In fact, after so many years of benevolent rule, the Habsburg family's position in Austria is still stable enough that you don't need to worry too much if you have to. Count Latter looked worried. As the leader of the Joseph faction, how could he still not know what Franz was going to do? Count Latter has been looking forward to this day since he was young, but when it comes, he is the most hesitant. After all, no one wants the tragedy of prosperity and decline to happen again. Although he has not experienced this era, the Queen's reputation is still spread in Austria, and it was a possibly greater monarch who ended all that. At this time, Count Latter in the era of Ferdinand, I suddenly felt that it could not be worse. The changing expression of the Minister of War made it easy to tell what he was thinking at a glance. As an old friend, Count Korolov patted him on the shoulder. Hasn't the army changed its equipment several times? The number of the army has also been expanded several times. What do you have to be afraid of? Who said I was afraid? Count Latter opened his old friend's hand and defended. I was just thinking about how to minimize the scale of the war. Franz did not expect this kind of statement from the top officials of the empire. After all, in his eyes, these people were representatives of the old forces. Of course, it is also possible that a group of old foxes teamed up to show Franz, but this is not important. In fact, Franz was still planning how to persuade them before, but it seems that it is no longer necessary now. Thank you all, but I just want to use more reasonable grammar to read this government announcement, and I don't want to target any one point, but I must make it clear that some actions and words that are too biased in favor of the Polish nobility may cause greater dissatisfaction. After all, it is the civilians who bleed and sacrifice the most on the front line. We should give them justice, and those Poles who had been hanged for participating in the rebellion in Russia should thank us instead of accusing us of inappropriate words. Then let's vote by a show of hands. Although Metternich had spoken righteously before, he would not take the blame himself. Archduke Franz Karol grabbed the hand of Archduke Louis, which was regarded as 2 votes of royal support. Naturally, Prince Metternich and Count Korolov who had previously expressed their loyalty, would not go back on their word at this time point. As a result, the Regent Council unanimously approved the plan, and of course, final modifications would be made before it was made public. Then the compensation plan for the Polish nobles of Galicia turned into an amnesty order, and the transfer of protection also turned into meritorious service. The article also specifically emphasized Dalmatia, the place of exile. Most people in the aristocratic circles remained indifferent to it. The Poles were dissatisfied and protested, but the ordinary people seemed to be celebrating it. Franz took the opportunity to launch a series of promotional activities and promote some new products, such as kebabs, fried skewers, and potato chips. After all, eating melon and watching a show requires snacks and beer. The promotion of Pilsner beer allows the working people to buy a cup from time to time. The sudden half-price sale made the whole city drunk. When the convoy of Polish nobles who were exiled to Dalmatia drove through the streets of Vienna, the citizens of Vienna burst into unprecedented patriotic enthusiasm and national honor. The angry citizens frightened the nobles, reminding them of the fear that the French nobles once had at the hands of the common people, and of the French Revolution, the guillotine, and the great devil Robespierre. After that, the protests of the nobles became much quieter, and only a few nobles still went around denouncing the cruelty and tyranny of the empire. However, these targets were pointed at Prime Minister Metternich and Interior Minister Count Korolov in the Regency Council. Both of them were well prepared, but chose to remain silent and neither explained nor objected. And those nobles who stirred up trouble everywhere suddenly became the targets of German nationalists. The reason for the latter is simple. Even Metternich, an old traitor, and Korolov, a corrupt official, did not stand up for the Poles, so the former must be a heinous person who surpasses them. In this era of nationalist awakening, there are many kinds of nationalists in the Austrian Empire, but under the guidance and secret support of France, Austrian nationalists are on the rise. They are more tolerant and more stable than other nationalists, but the disadvantage is that they are poorly organized and rational but lack enthusiasm, so the most violent ones are still the German nationalists. Regarding the handling of the Polish nobles, the direction of public opinion in the Austrian Empire also changed from the emperor's mercy to justice. In fact, this is also to lay the groundwork just in case. If the Poles rebel again, it will be easy to suppress them without too much public opinion and moral pressure. At this time, the ethnic issues within the Austrian Empire were very complicated. Italians had become the second largest ethnic group in the empire, and were highly concentrated in northern Italy. There are constant conflicts between the new immigrants and the indigenous people, and there are also frictions between the northern Italians and the Austrian imperial government. They are eager to gain power, but the government of any country will not allow an independent nation to dominate a region. Representatives of northern Italy hoped that Austria could withdraw its troops and cede political power, allowing locals to form a parliament to elect officials. This all sounds very good, but their purpose is to establish a state within a state. The coastline of the Austrian Empire is very limited. If they succeed, the harm will be much greater than that of Hungary. Therefore, it was impossible for the empire to agree, so the northern Italians began to join forces to try to use other methods to solve the problem. They began to hold banquets like the French. Naturally, the Austrian Empire cannot sit still and wait for death. More than 10 million Italians are too large, so it is necessary to spread them out. Metternich's idea was to recruit 50,000 young Italians into the army in the future, and then move the Italians to the colonies and areas such as Dalmatia, Bosnia, Montenegro and northern Albania to disperse their power. Chapter 784 Italians with polarized opinions. In fact, the higher one stands, the farther one can see. But this is not always a good thing. For example, Prince Metternich overestimated the so-called Italians at this time. It makes people feel a little sad that Prince Metternich, who once vowed to turn Italy into a geographical term, is getting old after all. Compared with the title Italian, Venetians, Lombards, Tuscans, Parma, Lucca, Modenese, Romans, Sicilians, and Sardinians are more likely to be called Italian accepted due to thousands of years of geographical isolation. They have formed different cultures and habits, and even their languages are also different. Historically, the Italian government started the process of modernizing the Italian language in 1870, and promoted the Tuscan dialect. also known as the Florentine dialect or Tuscan language. It took 120 years to solve the language problem. The conflict between North and South in Italy still exists today. However, it is not appropriate to allow these guys to be highly concentrated in northern Italy. After all, no one knows whether they will cause any new problems like goo refining in the end. What Franz thought of was to move it to Tripoli. After all, this place would be very important in the future, and the local population was seriously insufficient. Not to mention development, even infrastructure could not be completed. In fact, there is another point, that is, the execution and dominance displayed by the Caramanli family are far from Franz's expectations. Letting them rule this area is really inefficient to the point of waste, and northern Italy is full of sailors and dockworkers. In fact, Italian city-states also had a business tradition, so Franz felt that the plan was feasible. His first step was to prepare to immigrate 30,000 people to the Tripoli area from 1846 to 1850. In fact, there were immigration plans earlier, but relying on natural immigration was too slow. After the Second Turkish-Egyptian War, by 1846, less than 2,000 people from Austria immigrated to Tripoli. Compared to Tripoli, the natural environment in Tunisia next door is much superior. After all, it was the birthplace of Carthage civilization. But the reality is that Britain, France, Sardinia, and even the United States all had a hand in it. Even if Tunisia made 2 attempts to attack Tripoli as a bandit, the Austrian side could only regard it as ordinary handling of banditry incidents. So don't think about Tunisia for the time being, unless some kind of agreement is reached with other powers one day, or some kind of large-scale conflict breaks out. As for the recruitment of Italians into the army, Franz maintained a wait-and-see attitude. Because at this time, the evaluation of Italian soldiers in Austria was polarized. Some people held the same view as later generations, and felt that Italian soldiers lacked the will to fight, and the fighting qualities. Morale is always low, obedience is astonishingly poor, unorganized, and undisciplined. Marching is like hiking, and fighting is like going to the market. In short, they don't look like an army. In addition, the Italians are also a group of people in the army who like to be aggressive. They often form secret societies and use their wisdom and strength to escape military sanctions and deal with their own people. Another group of commanders believed that Italian soldiers were hardworking, versatile, highly motivated, and had a spirit of sacrifice. In fact, Italian soldiers cannot be generalized, but at least they are good cooks and logistics troops, as well as excellent hunters. Franz feels that the reason why some outrageous situations occur is mainly due to the overemphasis on humanism, which makes them lack team spirit and discipline. At the same time, there is also a lack of recognition and consensus, because since the fall of ancient Rome, the Italian region has always been in a state of divided city-states. The geographical fragmentation is more serious than that of the German region, and there has been a long-term lack of real threats. The last point is that Italians are often discriminated against. Their military salaries are often lower than those of other ethnic groups, and they cannot be paid on time and in full. Other issues require reform and education to slowly change, but Franz thinks the military pay issue is easy to handle. After all, the Austrian Empire is really not short of money now. In order to reduce the rapidly increasing gold reserves, it has to choose to scatter coins and carry out some investments that are hard to understand. As for the mutual connection between Italians, Franz didn't care much. After all, they preferred to form small groups than to unite. If they didn't do anything, they would fight on their own. And he also hopes that potential enemies will emerge on their own, which in a sense, is luring the snake out of its hole. Since the family's reputation and national image have to be taken into consideration, there are not many opportunities to eradicate the problem. What Franz did actually did not conflict much with Prince Metternich's policy, so the two policies could be carried out at the same time. On the island of Ireland, the situation is getting worse as the potato crop is almost gone again. This time there will be no more food in the cellar. At the same time, food prices in the UK have hit record highs, and more food is being shipped from the island of Ireland to the UK mainland. The number of people dying of starvation continued to rise, while more Irish people who could not afford the rent were evicted from their homes. The vast majority of land in Ireland belonged to landowners. Even their homes, the landowners had almost the power of medieval feudal lords, and their profits suffered due to the effects of the famine point, but those poor Irish people really couldn't afford the rent. So the British landowners thought of a new waypoint, that is to rent the original land to two families, which can not only make up for their losses, but also make a small profit. But this will make the life of the Irish even more difficult. The British imitated the Austrian relief for work program and declared bankruptcy. At the same time, typhoid fever and cholera broke out in the workhouses. Several cartloads of corpses were loaded every day and taken to the suburbs for burial. But the British have never had a lower limit when it comes to being inappropriate. Colonial Secretary Lord William Gladstone proposed that the Irish could be immigrated to Australia, which would not only solve the problem of sparse population in the colony, but also alleviate the famine problem on the island of Ireland. This proposal sounds like there is no problem. The problem is that when it was implemented, they found that it was not as cost effective to immigrate Irish Catholics as to buy black slaves from East Africa. Britain would lure Protestants from Germany, but abandon its own Catholics. At this time, the governor of New South Wales expressed an opinion that there were too few local women, and hoped that the British government could immigrate more women to solve the fertility problem. At that time, Australia was not a viceroyalty, but a geographical term composed of several viceroyalties, so the British government decisively adopted the governor of South Wales's suggestion to select healthy and age-appropriate women in the workhouses. Countless dirty transactions took place, and eventually batch after batch of Irish girls were lured to Australia to be used as reproductive tools for lower class colonists who were almost twice their age. In this era, the corruption of high level life in the colonies was actually no worse than that in big European cities. Naturally, they looked down upon these ordinary girls. In fact, senior officials of the South Wales colony stated, "Our money should be spent on decent, well-educated girls, not wasted on a bunch of base and ignorant creatures." Although the lowest class in the Australian colonies would not starve to death, high-intensity labor and childbirth could not bring them dignity and material satisfaction. What most people received was nothing more than a long sentence of double physical and mental torture. Chapter 785. It's difficult to start a fire when a new official takes office. As one of the leaders of the Irish at this time, Daniel O'Connell personally received the attention of the British government and received many personal honours and financial rewards. But O'Connell's allies, the Whigs, who had brought down Robert Peel's Tories, failed to fulfill their promise to solve the famine. In fact, the new Prime Minister John Russell at this time was facing a mess that was much more difficult to deal with than he imagined. Robert Peel represents a conservative, but plays with free trade. Naturally, it is impossible for him to remain in office for a long time. A split ensued within the Tory party, and Robert Peel had to submit his resignation to Parliament. After the Whigs came to power, they found chaos everywhere, with war losses and threats that were difficult to completely resolve, scattering the country's forces. The global hegemony with the French is a bottomless pit, especially since the Russians actually sold Alaska to Louis Philippe. Now the French can directly threaten the British Canadian colony. What's even more terrible is that the Russians are ready to take action. Even if they are fighting a civil war, they do not forget to spy on the land near the Black Sea. The complete failure of the Jewish state plan not only affected Britain's reputation, but also changed the Ottoman attitude towards Britain. After the newly elected US president found that he could not continue his southern invasion, he targeted Canada, demanding exclusive possession of Oregon, and redrawing the northern border with Britain. Of course, as the toughest president in the history of the United States, James Polk was not a complete fool, so he chose the time when the British government was changing to add insult to injury. John Russell, who had just come to power, was almost angered by this great gift from the Americans. But this was not the only thing that troubled him. Prince Albert was not satisfied with just holding an expo in the country. Prince Albert hoped to promote British products to the world, which would not only demonstrate national strength, but also open up sales for goods. However, this view was completely a whimsical joke to economists and politicians at the time. Some even bet on whether this World Expo would plunge Britain into a new crisis with heavy debts. Unfortunately, Prince Albert has the support of Queen Victoria, and John Russell has nothing to do if the royal family insists on going its own way. It is really not a wise move to be tough on the royal family at this time point. In addition, the problem of railway fever has begun to emerge. Railway construction is changing from a high input, high return investment to a high input, low return infrastructure project. The British government was helpless about this, because no matter what it did, it would be British interests that would be harmed in the end, so it simply ignored it. Cholera in London is spreading across the country, and British experts have no way to prevent or treat it. 1. Can only hope that the illness is not serious, or try laudanum and bloodletting and other treatments, but they have no effect except making the patient suffer more. Expansion in the East has also fallen short of expectations, and there are many reports that a new crisis is brewing on the continent. At this time, Britain is facing an unprecedented diplomatic crisis, that is, from the East to the West, from the Australian indigenous people to the Irish. Next door, they have no friends. The Qing dynasty in Japan and East Asia, Nanming, Chenla, and the Dutch East India Company in Southeast Asia, Afghanistan and Central Asia, Oman and Madagascar in the Indian Ocean, and Egypt in North Africa. Although the Ottoman Empire relied on Britain at this time, it was no longer as obedient as in the past. The French had absolute dominance in the Franco-Spanish alliance in Western Europe, and France happened to be one of Britain's main competitors for world hegemony. Central Europe belongs to Austria. The German princes and small Italian states that had flirted with Britain in the past did not dare to make unnecessary moves under the constraints of the German customs union and the Apennine customs union. Switzerland was preparing for civil war. Strictly speaking, there were only two countries in Eastern Europe at this time, Russia and the Ottomans. The peoples in the Balkans could only choose which of the two countries was not so bad. Judging from what the British experienced in southern Albania, these three countries are actually evenly matched. The attitude of a series of secondary powers such as the United States, Brazil, and Mexico towards Britain is not good. Even Portugal, its most loyal brother, has a problem with Britain's military operations in southern Brazil. At this time, Queen Maria II of Portugal was the biological sister of Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. The two had the same father and mother, so it was impossible to side with the British emotionally. Among the Low Countries, the Netherlands joined the German Confederation, and Belgium was raised in France in name only. It doesn't feel good to be enemies of the whole world. Historically, the British could decide the life and death of a bunch of countries by just holding a diplomatic conference, and they could play tricks on the great powers without spending a single soldier. But now the situation has changed. The emergence of regional alliances and some minor changes in history have combined to make the British expansion costs increase exponentially. In fact, Robert Peel had discovered this problem long ago, and he also tried to change it, but after going around and around, he found that he was back to the original point. In fact, this is not because there is something wrong with the British thinking, but because the rhythm has changed. And everyone is not following its rhythm. In particular, the failure of the two London conferences and the rise of Austria. Or rather, it did not lose its influence and become a follower of the British as it did in history. These events prevented the British influence from reaching the level of one-stop response. Britain is an island country, which means its strategy cannot rely solely on its own army and navy like Russia and France. John Russell also discovered this problem, but what he could do was only some minor repairs, but it couldn't really change anything. But faced with a mountain of pressure, John Russell really couldn't care about the Irish on the banks of the Shannon River. O'Connell was rejected again and again, and he realized at this time that he was actually an outsider by chance. O'Connell learned of the colonial department's evil plan. He could no longer tolerate his compatriots being transported and trafficked like livestock. The two sides immediately struggled with each other. At first, the British Colonial Office planned to conceal the matter, but O'Connell was a social activist after all, and he was familiar with building momentum in the media. Even if the big newspapers don't dare to take it, there are always tabloids who want to make a splash. In the end, the matter of finding wives for the old bachelors at the bottom of the colony had to be abandoned, because even if they were nominally voluntary, they would inevitably be suspected of taking advantage of others. The pressure on the British government at this time is already too great, and it is completely unnecessary to add to heavier moral burden for no reason. Moreover, the countries on the European continent are ready to enjoy the show. When the time comes, they may not let the great England and the barbaric United States be ranked together. In fact, the reason why O'Connell was able to break through all this was because Franz planned it behind the scenes. Chapter 786, O'Connell's decision. The secrecy work of the British colonial department at that time cannot be said to be very bad. It can only be said to be almost non-existent. So it is not difficult for Franz to let O'Connell break the British conspiracy point. Of course, the officials of the British Colonial Office did not think this was a conspiracy, but a job that could benefit many parties, but it was just a little unethical point. However, looking at things from different angles, the conclusions drawn cannot be the same point. The most terrible thing is that the girls who were rescued by O'Connell did not thank him. On the contrary, they felt that he ruined their happiness for his own reputation. O'Connell was not angry, but he knew very well that, although he had prevented this conspiracy, as long as those refugees who were unable to support themselves continued to stay in the UK, they would be calculated to become the fuel of the British's wealthy life sooner or later. He began to reconsider the Austrians' proposal, a land where work could fill their stomachs, a land without religious discrimination, a new land where freedom to go and stay was possible. The Irish were discriminated against because of their Catholic identity, so they took this very seriously at the time. So Daniel O'Connell began to contact everyone he could. Immigration may not be the best choice, but it was the only choice he could think of at this time. At this time, the United States was still in a state of vast land and sparsely populated areas, and it urgently needed more people to enrich its land. In fact, this has become a major obstacle restricting the development of the United States. For this reason, it does not hesitate to poach people from the North German region at high prices. The United States promised not only high wages, but also land, freedom, and equality. At that time, the German region was mainly a monarchy, but its immigration policy for the Irish was not so good. The latter had to find work and food on their own, not even willing to pay for a boat ticket. There are two main reasons behind this. Firstly, German immigrants usually have skills at their disposal and have higher overall quality, which naturally leads to higher goals and expectations, while Irish immigrants are usually really poor and have no education, except for farming does nothing. Second, the Americans mainly poached North German Protestants, while Irish immigrants were basically Catholics. The Western world had experienced several religious wars, and the Americans naturally did not want the tragedy to happen again. Moreover, in the land of the United States, so-called religious freedom has never existed. At first, the reason Americans used to expel Indians was to expel pagans, but it was later beautified and became a necessity for the civilization and progress of mankind. The Irish also suffered discrimination in the United States. They were synonymous with poverty, laziness, filth, violence, sin, alcoholism, and superstition. Referring to Catholicism, before the resurgence of the Middle Eastern nations, the world's #1 terrorist in the eyes of Americans had always been the Irish from the Emerald Island. Many celebrities have claimed that Irish people are white on the skin, but dark on the inside. At that time, Irish people were treated the same as black and yellow people in the United States. Many Irish people even envied the pastoral life of black slaves. American factories follow the British system, with 16 to 18 hours a day, depending entirely on the price of the goods. If the profit can exceed the money of gas lamps, then overtime will be worked. However, due to the sluggish American industry at this time, most factories still operated on a 16-hour clock. Irish people had actually been immigrating to the United States since before the famine, but O'Connell wouldn't recommend people go there. First, because he still had hope in the British government at that time. And second, because he knew what the Irish had experienced in America. It wasn't until he died that he shouted to the sky, "Cross the sea, cross the sea, cross the sea." Now, Franz gave him a new choice. Although most Irish people did not understand German, there were many people in the Austrian Empire who did not speak German, and this country had existed for nearly 1,000 years, so it was not a big problem. The second is the Habsburg family's reputation for kindness, which was very important to the Irish at this time. After all, it ensured that they would not be mistreated or directly enslaved. Third, Franz personally came forward and offered a relatively favorable condition. the land in the Austrian colonies was allowed to be cultivated. During the period, they would be provided with necessary agricultural tools, seeds, food, livestock, if any, accommodation, medical care, education, and security. A sure point based on the calculation of each adult male in the family, who has labor force. If he can cultivate an average of 50 acres of land, he will not have to pay taxes for 1 year. If he can cultivate an average of 100 acres, he will not have to pay taxes for 3 years. And if he can cultivate an average of 150 acres, he will not have to pay taxes for 5 years. Considering that Irish people in this era usually had large families, it was normal for a family to have more than a dozen people, and 4 or 5 adult male laborers would occupy 600 to 700 acres of farmland. If you were in the East, you would be considered a landlord. You are free to stay and go at the same time, as long as you pay the toll. Going to Austria requires some special skills, assessments, and reviews. The most important one is to be able to speak German. In short, the requirements are definitely higher than those in the colonies. After all, Franz also has to consider domestic pressure. Although there is a church as a shield, if he really gets a bunch of old, weak, sick and disabled, he will probably be criticized abuse of favor. If a bunch of gangsters and hooligans are brought over, it will directly become the trigger of civil war. Finally, word of the contribution and sincerity of the Austrian Church and Archbishop Roche's trip to Ireland had spread throughout England. This is simply a provocation to the Anglican Church. But unfortunately they actually don't have much influence. John Russell is in no mood to continue to spend time with Austria because of this group of magicians. Moreover, Archbishop Roche only carried out some charity activities on the island of Ireland, and the British government really had no good reason to question Austria. In addition, John Russell knows better than anyone what kind of morality is present on the island of Ireland, and he does not want other European countries to continue to criticize it. As a result, the whole matter ended like this, but in O'Connell's view, this was a very sincere sign. He had regarded the Austrian Church as a life-saving straw for the Irish. In fact, every time the Austrian Empire's grain ships returned, they could take some Irish people away. This was also the so-called free ticket. But the reality is that the Irish would rather go bankrupt, go to the United States as slaves, or even ride on the cult's doomsday ark than board the Austrian ship. This was mainly due to people's fear of the unknown. At this time, the level of education of the Irish people was very low. More than 85% of them had never left the county level area where they were born, and the information was very limited. Fewer people know about the Austrian Empire than those who know about the Holy Roman Empire. In terms of popularity, it is even less famous than France's Towlin port and its own Venetian port. What O'Connell has to do is to trick his compatriots onto the ship, because according to Austrian calculations, if the total population of the island of Ireland has not changed this year, at least 50 to 1 million people will starve to death. This was hard to imagine when only 100,000 people starved to death in the first year, but Austria provided a confidential document. That is, before the famine occurred, the Austrian Church had placed hundreds of thousands of tons of grain across the island of Ireland, which had been eaten up in the past year. Chapter 787, The Beacon of the Land of Peace. So if the British government continues to do nothing this year, the number of people dying of starvation will increase exponentially. Even with the guarantee of O'Connell, a banner figure, the vast majority of Irish people are still doubtful. This has to be said that the British propaganda machine was quite successful. They successfully discredited Austria as an Arab country more barbaric than Russia. However, with the help of O'Connell, the Irish national leader, Franz believed that the locals' image of the Austrian Empire would be greatly improved. The 8.5 million Irish people were less than 6 million after the famine. Taking into account the natural increase in the population, 3 million was a reasonable number. If 1/6 of the 3 million people who disappeared could go to the Austrian colony, it would greatly alleviate the problem of insufficient manpower for land reclamation. As long as 1/4 could come to Franz, the infrastructure project of the colony could be completed. If he could get 1/3, Franz could recreate a medium-strength country in Central America. If it could send 1/2 of them, 1.5 million people. To West Africa. Austria could connect all its West African colonies together under ideal circumstances. If all 3 million people immigrated to the Americas, within 20 years France would dare to push the Americans east of the Mississippi River, completely insulating them from the Pacific Ocean. But this is naturally impossible. In fact, the first group of people to set foot on the road to Austria were the girls who were used by the British government as reproductive machines in the colonies, also known as famine orphans, because most of these people were lonely or had no contact with their families. Their desire to leave Ireland was very strong. Moreover, the British Parliament and the Anglican Church are also very willing to see that O'Connell, the national leader and spiritual leader of Ireland, has to defile himself as a pimp. No matter how low the moral bottom line of British politicians is, they will know what it means to send a group of young girls to a foreign country. As long as O'Connell does this, his entire life will be ruined, and this stain will be constantly mentioned even hundreds of years after his death. There is no escape from the crime of trafficking domestic women abroad for entertainment. At the same time, this will also put huge moral pressure on the Austrian side, who accepts it. However, at this point, there is no room for change. Every step back is a bigger whirlpool. At this moment, Austria's top leaders hope that O'Connell can cherish his reputation. After all, he is old, and it would not be good to lose his reputation at the end of the year, but O'Connell did it anyway, and the Austrian side could only accept the move. Fortunately, this is a stubborn problem for most countries in the world, and it is not difficult to solve in Austria. France can directly build a girls' school in Venice, a German school, where all teachers and students are female. This is completely unthinkable for other countries at this time, but it is completely feasible in Austria. Because girls' schools in Austria have been running for several years, only a few outstanding or well-connected graduates can join the government, scientific research institutions and business. The vast majority of them can only look after their husbands and raise their children, or have nothing to do, and opening a girls' school with this level of literacy is a great thing for them. After all, teaching in this era is a very respectable job. At the same time, with his backing to the royal family, his status has gone up. With the church and newspapers advocating from the side, they naturally had no reason not to go. Certainly, although Franz was tricked by the British, his original purpose was not to invite Ireland to enjoy the blessings. The agriculture and industry in the Venetian region are relatively developed, so it is not difficult to find some jobs for them. In fact, only some of the famine orphans who could reach the Austrian mainland were sent directly to the colonies. Some of them were too strange or too difficult to maintain. Therefore, when the upper class of the Austrian Empire visited the girls' school, they saw some gentle, considerate, and well-educated women. This would at least not make the nobles feel disadvantaged. At the same time, the power of role models also helps to plan for those who come after. The cost of transporting refugees is not high, because all the ships transporting refugees are actually merchant ships. After selling Austrian goods at high prices, some of the needed goods are purchased, and the remaining space is used to transport people. In fact, this is mainly because the vast majority of British goods are not attractive in Austria. Rather than running on empty, it is better to bring some people with you, so that you can not only gain a good reputation, but also make a little money. For the Austrian side, as long as the price of British food does not drop, there will always be money to be made in this life-saving business. Once again, although France and Spain were also hit by disasters and the price of food was very high, the tariffs were higher and they would lose money if they sold their January 1847 Swiss Confederation. At the Federal Congress in Geneva, the Free Alliance and the Orthodox Union were at loggerheads. As a country with 11 units of length, 82 units of grain measurement, 50 units of weight, and more than a dozen currencies, it would be abnormal for them not to fight. In fact, Lucerne is nominally the capital of the Swiss Confederation. However, due to the opposition of the Free Alliance, the Orthodox Alliance agreed to hold a federal conference in Geneva. On the territory of the Free Alliance, it is naturally difficult to gain the respect of the other party for being so weak. At this time, the representative of the Free Alliance, Joseph later president of the Swiss Confederation, just threw a document on the desk of the representative of the Orthodox Alliance, without even bothering to say a word. The representative of the Swiss Orthodox Union, a very senior mayor, stood up with great difficulty and leaned forward to get the document that was thrown a little far away in his hand. The mayor was immediately shocked after seeing it and almost fell from his seat to the ground. It took him a long time to stammer out a few words. Power is guaranteed by Austria, Prussia, France, and Sardinia. You are a challenge to the European order. The mayor didn't stutter, but he was so frightened that he couldn't speak clearly. Not to mention the existence of the Orthodox Alliance in the Swiss Confederation. Even if the entire Swiss Confederation is assembled, it is impossible to defeat the three powers. He felt that the person in front of him was crazy. But Joseph Lois sneered, "Idiot. We already have the support of the British Empire. If any country dares to interfere in our internal affairs, it is an enemy of the British Empire. Do your masters have the guts? You are crazy. Britain is far away, but the great powers are right next to you. If you fight a civil war, you will destroy yourself." The representative of the Orthodox Alliance was still trembling with fear, but he still managed to speak. "Mr. Representative, Switzerland is easy to defend, but difficult to attack. What if Austria, Prussia, France, and Sardinia join forces? As long as we block the mountain pass, they can't attack." "Blocking the mountain pass? You are really crazy. How can we survive if the mountain pass is blocked?" "That won't bother you. If you don't sign the document now, you won't even be able to leave this room." Joseph Loy gracefully lit the cigar in his mouth with a candle, took a nice puff, and then blew out a few smoke rings leisurely. "Hurry up, okay? If you don't sign your name before I finish smoking the cigar, you won't be needed here." Chapter 788. Bishop Miniful. After thinking for about a minute, the representative of the Orthodox Alliance signed the document and stamped it with a seal symbolizing the supreme power of the Orthodox Alliance. After returning to Lucerne, the representative handed over all his powers to the then State Secretary Konstantin Sigvort. A month later, tax collectors from the Liberal Alliance began to enter the states of the Orthodox Alliance to prepare to take over state taxation. Only then did the states of the Orthodox Union discover that their state representatives had actually sold their state's fiscal and taxation powers to their enemies. When angry people began to search for the representative, the latter had already arrived in the United States and lived a wealthy and leisurely life. Of course, the money also came from the Alliance's reserve fund, and half of the money raised for the war was directly taken away. In order not to alarm the bank, the representative specially found a French black marketeer to help. The intermediary fee was already close to 1 million Swiss francs. This incident directly put the Orthodox Alliance into a passive situation, but fortunately, it was only a personal signature of the state representative, and not recognized by the states. Since the power of fiscal and taxation is related to the livelihood of each state, it is naturally not easy to give up. Therefore, the tax officials of the Free Alliance have been rejected. No state in the Orthodox Alliance is willing to give up its power of fiscal and taxation. This situation cannot continue forever. The Orthodox Alliance proposed a negotiated settlement, but the Free Alliance obviously did not want to negotiate. When the former thought that things would continue to be stalemate, the latter issued an ultimatum: if the two sides cannot reach an agreement, then the Federation will declare the Orthodox Alliance unconstitutional. When things have developed to this point, both sides have understood that a war is inevitable. The Free Alliance has notified the British ambassador before, so the news of the Swiss Civil War is already on its way to Britain. In addition, the Freedom Alliance has also made many deployments and has been intensifying its troops over the years. Although it did not meet the expectations of veteran Dufa, it still managed to create an army of 130,000 people, but the equipment was ridiculously poor. In order to ensure victory, the Free Alliance will seal various mountain passes, while the great powers intervene, and at the same time, send fleets to intercept all ships on Lake Geneva and Lake Constance, waiting for the British to deal with the great powers. But before that, the Free Alliance must win the war, otherwise everything will be in vain. The Orthodox Alliance was much more chaotic. in addition to a group of idiots who naively believed that the Free Alliance would come to Lucerne, the nominal capital of Switzerland at this time, to negotiate. There were also Jesuit priests from the Papal States who were causing trouble. That's right. Pius IX came again, and this time he sent the strongest general in the Papal State, Bishop Manful the Invincible. This man only participated in 3 battles in his life. One was to wipe out an army of unbelievers who desecrated the Holy City. In fact, he was a criminal gang composed of only 3 people. Another time was the elimination of an evil witch and her evil army, which was actually an old woman and her 5 sons who couldn't pay taxes the last time. And the greatest victory achieved by the Papal States in recent years, Bishop Manful the Invincible led 500,000 Papal State troops, actually 20,000, to put down the rebellion in San Marino. Note, at that time, San Marino had a permanent population of 4,300 people, and fewer than 200 people participated in the rebellion. Constantine Sigvort has admired the Invincible for a long time, and Bishop Manful also decided to show his hand. Bring the defense map. Pastor Billet on the side immediately offered it respectfully, and Bishop Manful just looked at it twice before saying, "Garbage. Garbage. It's all garbage." As timid as a rat. Short-sighted as a rat. How can such a rat lead you to victory? Tell me who that trash commander is. I must put him to shame. As soon as Bishop Manful said this, the senior leaders of the Orthodox Alliance immediately hesitated. Manful already knew this, and said with a smile, "You are still young, and war requires experience. Setting up defenses is indeed a bit too naive, but you don't have to feel ashamed, let alone be afraid, because I, the Invincible Manful, am here, and I lead you to victory on the orders of Pope Pius X. As long as I'm here, don't worry." After Bishop Manful finished speaking, the expected sounds of admiration did not ring out, and everyone in the combat command room looked strange. What's going on? Don't you believe me? The new state representative Constantine Sigvort pointed to the side awkwardly. "We didn't make this defense map. Who is that? Archduke Karl of the Austrian Empire. Crazy. Karl. No, the one who fought with Napoleon." Manful was speechless for a moment, then burst into laughter after a long silence. Ha. Ha ha ha. Bishop Manful, why are you laughing? I laugh at Archduke Karl for being a famous general, but he only knows how to stick to the old ways, and doesn't know how to adapt. No wonder even Napoleon can't defeat him. In fact, theoretically speaking, such outrageous remarks will be ignored, if not ridiculed. However, the reality is that there are very few people in the entire Orthodox Alliance who understand military affairs. They are either bishops, nuns, or some businessmen and lawyers, except for Pastor Billet and Captain Ulrich Salis, who had studied in Austria. The other senior leaders of the Orthodox Alliance not only did not refute Bishop Manful's words, but also showed signs of joy. Everyone praised the name of the Invincible, as if this man could have pressed France to the ground and rubbed him if he had been born decades earlier. The most exaggerated performance was a nun named Brandy, who actually knelt down and started praying, "Please, lead us to glorious victory, soon." Everyone in the house, either infected by it, or forced by pressure, knelt down to pray. Bishop Manful didn't so either. If we want to win, we must be brave, determined, and not afraid of sacrifice. Yes, Lord Bishop, don't interrupt. I haven't finished speaking yet. Manful finished speaking, and walked towards the map. Look. Here. Fribourg is the key. Fribourg should be regarded as an enclave of the Orthodox Alliance. It is surrounded by the forces of the Free Alliance, but in terms of terrain, it should be easy to defend, and difficult to attack. It has its own natural barrier and only a small number of troops can block the entrance of the valley. This is a microcosm of Switzerland. As long as they blow up the road and defend it, the attackers will have no choice for a while. But that's not what Manful wants to say. We should concentrate our forces here and take the initiative to achieve the goal of the center blooming. But our troops are not as strong as the separatists, said the new state representative Constantine Sigvort. Stupid. It's not about having many soldiers, it's about being pious. As long as we have God in our hearts, the weapons of those villains can't hurt us. Moreover, those villains will definitely encircle us from all sides when facing our own army in Fribourg. As long as we focus on a few breakthroughs, we can win. Once there is a gap in the enemy's defense, we can go north along the Salon River and go straight to their base point. I want to tell you that offense is the best defense. Mennefel's theory was indeed much more exciting than Archduke Karl's contraction strategy. Everyone couldn't help but applaud and lamented that the bishop was indeed the most powerful general in the history of the papal state. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 789 Aid. The new state representative Constantin Sigvard signed the decision to support the canton of Fribourg with the support of state representatives. It was already a week later when the news reached Archduke Karol. In fact, this was also instructed by Mennefel. After all, the former was an Austrian archduke. If he really had a dispute with him, it would probably destroy the harmony within the alliance. Archduke Karol, that's what happened. Bishop Mennefel completely disrupted your deployment, and also took a large number of troops and supplies to Fribourg. Captain Ulrich Salas recounted the incident exactly, and said apologetically that he was afraid that the old general would simply give up the job. After all, Bishop Mennefel's previous arrangements were in vain. Captain Ulrich Salas is temporarily acting as the field marshal of the Swiss Orthodox Union at this time, because the Orthodox Union really lacks commanders. This has nothing to do with studying in Austria. Mennefel took away 2/3 of the Swiss Orthodox Alliance's troops in one breath. Archduke Karol was not angry. On the contrary, he breathed a sigh of relief. Because the quality of the Swiss army is so low, the vast majority of the 100,000 troops of the Orthodox Alliance are farmers and unemployed craftsmen. Due to the Orthodox Alliance's lack of officers, lack of crisis awareness, and lack of supplies, the vast majority of these soldiers have never even fired a gun, let alone trained systematically. Moreover, these soldiers have obvious geographical characteristics and are severely differentiated from each other. They are timid in public battles and brave in private fights. They are difficult to command and often disturb the people. He can take them all, except the security and logistics forces. Marshal Ulrich Salas thought he heard wrongly. This is not good. There's nothing wrong with it. They can't do much good, except waste food here. Marshal Ulrich Salas thought that Archduke Karol was talking angrily. Grand Duke Karol, don't worry. I will do my best to recruit another army for you. I promise. We have already asked for help from neighboring countries, and I believe that help will arrive soon. The reality is that the Orthodox Alliance has indeed sent a signal for help to surrounding countries, hoping that the great powers can provide military support, but the armies of the great powers have been threatened by the Free Alliance. Joseph Loy said that if the armies of the great powers dared to enter Switzerland, the Free Alliance would blow up all the passages from Switzerland to the outside world. At the same time, Britain's credentials also arrived, reaffirming Britain's position that it did not want any country to intervene in the Swiss Civil War. In fact, the name of the war launched by the Free Alliance at this time was to require the Orthodox Alliance to fulfill its promise of unified taxation, not to annex the other side. This directly bypasses the previous 1843 agreement initiated by the Austrian Empire. That is, the inviolability of the neutrality of the Swiss Confederation will only be respected if the 1815 treaty is not violated. If the Swiss Confederation fails to strictly abide by the treaty, Austria will have the right to withdraw its previous commitments. Among them, the French were the first to respond to the Swiss Orthodox Union. Louis Philippe's behavior was not only to gain an advantage and win over allies, but also to please the domestic church. Louis Philippe very much hoped to win over Switzerland as an ally. After all, Austria, an old rival in the German region and coastal lowlands, already had an advantage at this time, and the Kingdom of Sardinia was also its in-law in Italy. Therefore, Switzerland has become an important target. After all, if France and Austria really go to war one day, and all three roads are unilaterally open to Austria, then this battle will be too difficult to fight. However, it was threatened twice by Switzerland and Britain, and at the same time the Austrian Empire did not take much action. The French cabinet began to weigh seriously. After all, if France sends troops at this time, will it be considered destroying the Vienna system of 1815? So Soult was more hesitant than Louis Philippe. The former just wanted to retire honorably, didn't want to get into any trouble in his later years, and didn't care about any bullshit honors, as long as he didn't lose his security later in life. However, the current situation is that, if he is not careful at all, he may be in danger at the end of the season. Historically, it was Guizot who strongly advocated supporting Switzerland, but this man is still in North America at this time and naturally cannot participate in this incident. There was silence in the cabinet of the July monarchy. No one wanted to be the first person, but everyone knew that, if Switzerland continued to fall to the Habsburg side, what awaited France would be a three-pronged defeat. Finally, a young officer named Charles expressed his opinion: "Your Majesty, Prime Minister, and distinguished ministers, France cannot lose Switzerland as an ally." "You don't have to say that," a cabinet member interrupted rudely. The Bonapartists were always an anomaly in the July dynasty, but in the final analysis, this dynasty itself was an anomaly. The young officer was not as enthusiastic as an ordinary young military attaché, but analyzed the situation like a seasoned politician. Of course, everyone knows this well, and will not elaborate on it. Finally he gave his own advice: "We could also have a volunteer army like the Austrians did. Then, who will lead the team?" The previous cabinet member said again that, because of this kind of non-governmental behavior, not only may it not be recognized by the government, but it may even not be possible to receive pensions. "Your Majesty, I'm willing to go. Long live France." The cabinet member had no choice but to keep his mouth shut. After all, it would be best if someone was willing to do such a life-threatening thing. Louis Philippe couldn't help but take a second look at this young man named Charles. He was also the one who handled crisis management when the German mission came to visit. The former patted the latter on the shoulder and said, "You are capable of both literary and military skills. You are truly a role model for the younger generation in France. Come back alive, and I will promote you to the rank of general." Theoretically speaking, Louis Philippe did have this power at this time, but it was just a matter of whether he should use it, and whether the army would accept it. Although the scene of being ordered to go into danger and going deep alone is very touching, the IQ of the French commander at this time is equally touching. For example, they want to send a batch of weapons to help the Swiss Orthodox alliance, but leaving Nasjeta in Switzerland will not only have to pay taxes to the King of Prussia, but after they leave Nasjeta, their weapons will be surrendered by the states of the Free Alliance. At the same time, the French High Command was studying the transportation of supplies and weapons from Lake Geneva in Switzerland. After all, heavy artillery and other things were too slow to take the mountain road of Nasjeta. As a result, France's weapons and material assistance to the Orthodox alliance became an enemy. The most important thing was that Dufour finally obtained the heavy artillery he wanted so much. Note, at that time, the level of weapons in Switzerland was very low and could only produce some simple smoothbore weapons. After all, the quality of ironware was extremely poor and there was often a risk of the bore exploding. Of the 15,000 volunteers, only Colonel Charles, 1,200 of them, managed to sneak into Switzerland. Although there are many French people in Switzerland, these people are basically Protestants, and their living habits and accents are also different. It is easy for locals to distinguish them from the French. Chapter 798, Northern Italy, Kingdom of Sardinia. Carlo Alberto was not a lonely king. He always wanted to use a dynastic war to expand his territory. The Swiss Civil War at this time was undoubtedly an opportunity, so Carlo Alberto immediately sent a batch of weapons and supplies to the Orthodox alliance. After the supplies were delivered to Ticino, the soldiers from the Kingdom of Sardinia left. After all, the Freedom Alliance threatened to blow up the mountain road. It would not be good for the Kingdom of Sardinia to really drive these guys to the point of jumping over the wall, and Carlo Alberto was even more afraid that the two powerful neighbors around him would take the opportunity to attack. However, what he didn't know was that all these things had been seized by the Canton of Ticino, and he didn't even know that the Canton of Ticino had already joined the Free Alliance at this time. That's right. In fact, as long as the money is in place, or the shamelessness is enough, Catholic states can also join the Protestant alliance. to beat up the Catholic alliance. Point in history, Prince Metternich also did such a stupid thing. When the Austrian Empire's economy was on the verge of collapse, he scraped together 30 million florins and 20,000 rifles, and sent them to Ticino to support the Orthodox alliance. The result is that the Free Alliance uses the money sent by His Excellency the Prince to recruit troops, and then uses Austrian weapons to beat its allies. But at this time Franz had sent the money and weapons to Galicia, and he could use these things to train another army. This army is mainly composed of former refugees and serfs. They have just been allocated land and have finally lived a new life. They are most enthusiastic about ensuring their own way of survival. At the same time, they also have a strong sense of belonging and admiration for the country of Austria. Psychology. Coupled with patriotic education and church brainwashing, the future will be an important force in Franz's hands. Those responsible for the training were some veterans who had retired from the Royal Dragoons. Most of these people had not participated in the previous Battle of Galicia. They retired because they were too old, or because of injuries they had suffered in Hungary. Although Franz gave each retired veteran a substantial pension, the skills these people have honed their whole lives will definitely not be willing to be wiped out. So Franz gave them another chance, and the loyalty of these people was very guaranteed, and they would not cultivate a rebel army for Austria closer to home. Most of the remaining southern German countries are powerless. After all, Baden and Württemberg are not really powerful countries. Of course, there are also those like Bavaria, who not only refuse to provide friendly sponsorship, but also ask for benefits from the Orthodox alliance. What's even worse is that they don't do anything, even after receiving money. However, King Frederick William IV of Prussia, who was far away, was very interested in this, because his family territory in Asgeta was among them. Although this territory often resists taxes, it is still Brandenburg's property. If this group of Swiss take the opportunity to rebel, the losses will be huge. So Frederick William IV sent his brother Wilhelm Friedrich Ludwig, the famous Prince of Shotgun, William I, with 300 guards, to protect the family property. The Prince of Shotgun joined the army at the age of 10, and at the age of 17 he joined the army with the rank of captain to participate in the anti-Napoleonic War. He fought a fierce battle with Napoleon's army at Barcerobe near Frankfurt. So I didn't care about this trip to Switzerland. In fact, there was another reason, and that was that the great powers at that time generally believed that the Swiss Confederation's army was not as large as they boasted. After all, it is not uncommon for the number of troops to be mixed in this era, especially when small countries exaggerate in order to protect themselves. For example, Belgium previously claimed to have an army of 200,000, but in fact it is still unknown whether it has 20,000. The new state representative Constantin Sigvort and Field Marshal Ulrich Salis had high hopes for such help, but Archduke Karol did not care. Because we have discussed the situation of the Swiss Civil War with France countless times before, it is impossible for the great powers to send troops to intervene before the civil war expands. This is not that the threat from the Free Alliance and Britain is really that great, but the mutual constraints of France and Austria, which have been feuding for centuries. Theoretically speaking, no country can stop Austria and France from carving up Switzerland, unless Russia and Britain intervene at the same time. However, it is still a question whether the news can reach St. Petersburg before the carving up is completed. Despite this, the century-old feud between France and Austria is not so easy to resolve. Just like the previous partition of Belgium. Whenever the French had the opportunity, they would stab the enemy tentatively. Similarly, the French do not trust the Austrians, so they do not even have the basis of mutual trust, let alone cooperation. And once the buffer zone of Switzerland is lost, Austria and France will be in direct contact. The direct result of this will be war, endless war, and there will be too many conflicts of interest between the two sides. Therefore, Franz did not want to carve up Switzerland with France, and he did not want Switzerland, the sixth child, to pretend to be neutral every time, but to really sit on the fence, reaping the benefits, and then scolding her. That would either mean that the Orthodox alliance defeated the Free Alliance, or it would give the great powers a reason to intervene. Archduke Karol knew what he had to do, and he also knew the key to victory in this war. There are too many mountains in the Swiss Confederation. If you want to achieve a unilateral victory, you will fall into a quagmire like the Spanish War. Therefore, he had no intention of conquering all areas with force from the beginning. Naturally, those excessive soldiers had no purpose other than wasting food. And Marshal Ulrich Salis did not lie about one thing, that is, Switzerland's mobilization ability far exceeds the imagination of the great powers. The energy that this universal compulsory military service system can exert is that countries like Austria that still implement a military recruitment system unimaginable. At first, according to Archduke Karol's estimate, the Swiss Confederation's ability to mobilize 100,000 troops at full strength was already the limit, according to Austrian standards, but the reality is that the Orthodox Alliance alone can easily pull out 100,000 troops, which is not at full capacity. According to intelligence, the Free Alliance had more troops. He couldn't imagine how many soldiers this country could recruit if it tried its best. However, Archduke Karol understood why Franz had to intervene in the Swiss Civil War. Such a threat should not exist, let alone be out of Austria's control. Just as the two sides were arranging their troops in full swing, the Freedom Alliance once again sent an invitation to the Orthodox Alliance, requesting a federal meeting to discuss the country's taxation issues. Vienna, Hofburg Palace. Prince Metternich was very depressed because Franz intercepted his relief supplies to Switzerland. But what annoyed him even more was that the small Swiss state dared to openly challenge the Vienna system and the 1843 agreement. This is not the first time that the Swiss Free Alliance has challenged his bottom line. It previously hosted the Carbonari and the Polish Zionist army, and funded rebels in Austria. If it weren't for the fact that Switzerland is the buffer zone between Austria and France, he would definitely let those fanatics know how many guns, artillery and horses the Austrian Empire has. Chapter 791 Meeting. Metternich was very angry, but the reality was that he really had no good solution. If the Swiss really ignored the bombing of the St. Gallen Pass and the two small roads in Ticino, then the Austrian Empire would not be able to enter even with thousands of troops. In fact, in the past, the Swiss Confederation was able to overthrow the Holy Roman Empire and even defeat Austria to the point of losing its ancestral territory. In addition to the instigation of the great powers, it was difficult to deploy troops in the Swiss mountainous areas, and the inability to keep up with supplies was also a big problem. Note, the birthplace of the Habsburg family is Egelberg in the canton of Argau, Switzerland. Although it cannot be taken by force, Prince Metternich is a man known as the Prime Minister of Europe, and he has his own way of solving problems. That's right. This is a meeting. Don't underestimate the power of international conferences. They are a knife that can kill without blood. Compared with investing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of troops into the battlefield, this approach seems cheap, efficient and elegant. As a veteran who has been involved in diplomacy for more than half a century, Prince Metternich knows very well what can and cannot be touched. He plans to spend a month preparing for a diplomatic conference, and the specific date may be postponed for another 2 months. After all, it was still winter and St. Petersburg was not navigable. It might take a month to send the message. It might be April 1847, when Russia selected its representatives and then sent them over. This was probably the largest diplomatic conference in the world since the end of Napoleon. In addition to France and the Kingdom of Sardinia, which border Switzerland, there are also important regional powers such as Russia, Sweden, Spain, and Prussia, as well as all the princely states of the entire German Confederation. Who allowed the Swiss Confederation to border Baden and face Württemberg and Bavaria across the lake. So many countries were invited, but only the UK was not included. This was not only to facilitate the exclusion of British forces, but also to avenge the UK's decision to hold the London Conference alone without Austria as a chair. The London Conference in the book did not take place, but it is impossible not to remember the British approach. There are only 3 paths the British can take at this time, either to sabotage the Congress of Vienna and prevent it from happening, just like what Austria, France did back then. Either join, if you can't beat them, come uninvited, and then take the opportunity to repair the relationship, or take the opportunity to cause trouble, so that Austria cannot achieve its goals. Finally, there is another way, which is not to acknowledge all the results of the meeting. Palmerston used it during the Second Congress of Vienna, but to no avail. It is unlikely that this approach will work at this time, because Austria, France, the Kingdom of Sardinia and South Germany completely surround Switzerland. In fact, if you look carefully, there is Liechtenstein, with a population of less than 3,000, and an army of less than 100 people. Grand Duke Alois II of Liechtenstein serves as his own commander-in-chief. Once the agreement is reached, it will be difficult for the UK to shake it, just like how Austria, France, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg divided Belgium before. London, England. John Russell cursed as soon as he got the news. Ease the relationship. Why don't you understand? He really didn't know who gave Joseph Roy the courage. In this situation, how could Britain have the energy to participate in matters on the European continent? The most terrifying thing was that Palmerston, who had just returned from the Tory rebellion, gave him a big gift upon meeting him. How could he be so bold as to frighten the Austrians and the French with credentials that were not signed by himself or the Queen? Your Majesty, Prime Minister, please sign this letter of credence. Palmerston did not answer John Russell's words, but the letter of credence that was about to be sent to Europe pushed the latter. I really regret letting you, a traitor, continue to be foreign minister, causing me to have to wipe your ass. Although John Russell was very unhappy, he was still prepared to fulfill his obligations as a party leader. Your Majesty, Prime Minister, you are wrong. You are solving the worries of the British Empire, not my personal problems. Palmerston has done many ridiculous things, such as messing with the Queen's maid at the Queen's castle, so his words sound like sophistry to others. Mr. Palmerston, please don't be pretentious. It is your fault for provoking the Swiss Civil War. You know full well that we in the UK cannot really end up joining their side, but this allows the Austrians themselves to destroy the Vienna system, and no matter which side wins, the contradiction between France and Austria will further deepen. In the end, it will be our British Empire that will benefit. John Russell's personal talents were far inferior to those of Palmerston and Robert Peel. In history, the former became the British Prime Minister twice, and was ousted twice. He lacked economic, internal affairs, and diplomatic talents. Even his brother felt that he was an incompetent Prime Minister, so Lord Russell at this time simply could not understand what Palmerston was doing. What do you mean, my Lord Prime Minister? I'm saying that what makes our country great is its glorious independence policy. We have more important things to do than what is happening on the continent, such as solving the problem of overproduction in our factories, the unreasonable demands of the Americans, and the Irish on the Shannon. Palmerston obviously had his own plan, but John Russell hated such a smart guy. The latter did not pay attention to those so-called problems, but pointed the finger at Palmerston himself. Since you know that we are facing so many problems, why do you take the initiative to provoke those guys on the European continent? Faced with the Prime Minister's doubts, Palmerston appeared very calm. If we don't find something for them to do, can we do our thing with peace of mind? The navies of Austria and France are no longer what they used to be. Although the previous intervention in the Viceroyalty of La Plata failed, the European countries' the navy is no longer something we can ignore. And some problems may require the help of the army to solve, such as Canada's border and eastern trade issues. Switzerland is located at the junction of the three countries, and its geographical location is very important. No one of the three countries will give up easily. But if either France or Austria gets Switzerland, wouldn't it affect the balance of power on the European continent? No, Mr. Prime Minister, Switzerland's terrain is mainly mountainous. The terrain is narrow and difficult to navigate. It is difficult to maintain supplies, let alone the army. Moreover, the population is sparse and the economy is weak, so the impact on the two big countries is minimal. But the impact of the already fragile balance on the European continent is enough to set off huge waves in the future. The most important thing is that after the Swiss barrier disappears, Austria will directly border France. By then, both sides will have no choice but to fight. When Palmerston said this, everyone present showed evil smiles, and John Russell also knew what to do next. When they fight until both sides are injured, we can reap the benefits. Yes, that's it. Okay, I'll go find the Queen to sign it right away. This is Lord John Russell who wants to take credit. Chapter 792 repeating the same trick. Geneva, Switzerland. The delegation of the Orthodox Alliance once again came to the temporary meeting place of the Federal Parliament, and the representative of the Liberal Alliance was still Joseph Loy. There was still no consultation or negotiation, not even a cup of coffee. Joseph Loy threw a draft document to the representatives of the Orthodox Union. The representatives looked at each other, confused. But he still carefully picked up the document that was deliberately thrown away. There were 2 short sentences on it: end the civil war and dissolve the Orthodox Alliance. Representatives from the states of the Orthodox Union were even more confused. The negotiations haven't started yet. Have you already drawn up an agreement? An Orthodox Alliance representative asked angrily. Joseph Roy sat leisurely in his seat and answered softly, no, it's over. You have gone too far. You have no sincerity at all. I will not sign this agreement. Let's see the outcome on the battlefield. The representative who spoke before stood up angrily and prepared to leave, and the representatives of the surrounding Orthodox Alliance also stood up one after another, but they were not able to leave, but were forced back to their seats by 2 Free Alliance soldiers with bayonets. Joseph Loy asked calmly, are you going to start a civil war? It's you who want to provoke a civil war. The Valais representative replied angrily, no, I'm giving you a chance. Whether it is peace or war, I hope you can choose carefully. We will not accept your peace. We are federal MPs and you have no right to restrict our personal freedoms and ask us to leave. Sir, what's your name? Joseph Loy asked politely. Representative of the canton of Valais. Huluka. Before he could finish his words, he heard a bang and the man fell down, clutching his chest. The gun in Joseph Loy's hand was still smoking. Sister Brandy, who was present, immediately let out a scream. The remaining deputies wanted to escape, but were stopped by the guards. Quiet. Quiet. Shut up. Joseph Roy roared, and the room finally became quiet. I just executed the traitors who disrupted the peace. You can choose to sign here, so that you can still retain your official position and corresponding treatment. But if you want to destroy the peace of the peaceful country, Mr. Hulical will be your fate. Okay, I don't want to waste time. Please give me an answer before I finish smoking this cigarette. Okay. Joseph Loy lit a cigar and started smoking. He looked relaxed and content, but the representatives of the Orthodox Alliance were sweating profusely and trembling all over. Finally, the representative of the canton of St. Gallen walked over to the agreement and signed his name. Then the representative of the canton of Argor also walked over, and then the representative of the canton of Tikhonov. As soon as everyone saw someone signing, they stepped forward to sign their names and stamp the seal of their state government. In the end, only Sister Brandy from Lucerne was left who refused to sign. Joseph Loy was very satisfied. In fact, the representatives of the 3 states of St. Gallen, Argor, and Ticino had already been bribed by him. Only 2 states refused to sign, which was far beyond his expectation. But he still had to curse in his heart. A bunch of weaklings are worse than a woman. If the virtue of the Orthodox Alliance does not perish, it would be unjust. Except Miss Brandy, you can all leave. 3 days later, officials of the Free Alliance went to take over the states of the Orthodox Union with the agreement between the 2 parties, but they were rejected. The reason is that there is no signature or seal of the state representative. This time the Orthodox Alliance is smarter. They only recognize documents signed by the state representative and state governments. January 26, 1847. After negotiations between the 2 sides failed, Joseph Loy declared the Orthodox Alliance unconstitutional, and the war officially began. When the news reached Fribourg, the officers of the Orthodox Alliance could not help but admire the invincible Bishop Maniful. The bishop had anticipated that the Free Alliance would launch a war before the negotiations began, so at this time the Freiburg state had well-equipped troops and strong fortresses, and the troops of the Free Alliance really began to encircle them on all sides, just as the bishop said. Now, as long as Bishop Maniful said the same thing and concentrated his troops to break through a little bit, victory in the war would be just around the corner. Faced with the adulation of the crowd, Bishop Maniful showed extraordinary magnanimity and raised his hand to stop the noise. Soldiers, evil heretics had surrounded us, but the light of the Lord is everywhere. Ikigoa. all kinds of noisy cheers, because in addition to the 3 languages of German, Italian and French there are a lot of dialects. We have only 50,000 soldiers in Fribourg at this time, but the heretics who besiege us have an army of 100,000. But our 50,000 are like a fist, and their 100,000 are like a blank sheet of paper. As long as we poke with our hands, we can break through their defense. Soldiers, follow me on the expedition. Suppress the heretics. Victory, long live. At the beginning of the war, the Swiss Confederation of Free Arms made Henry Duffer commander-in-chief of the Free Army and the rank of general. To be honest, this veteran who participated in the French Revolution really didn't want to be stained with the blood of his own countrymen, but he knew very well that there were not many experienced generals in Switzerland. This is not to say that the Swiss have never fought in battles, but they have never fought in regimental battles, or even commanded a team of tens of thousands of people. As soon as he took office, Duffer stated that he would minimize the evils caused by war. His tactics were quite satisfactory. He first concentrated the main force to capture the isolated area of Fribourg. However, before Duffer's main force was assembled, he received news that the northern fortress of Fribourg was attacked. North of Fribourg, Free League fortress, this time Bishop Manifal almost launched an attack with his entire army. Facing a fortress with no more than 500 troops, 50,000 troops appeared confident. Although the war has not yet started, the Jesuit priests have already begun to sing praises for the bishop. The officers of the Orthodox Alliance were also very confident, and they begged Bishop Manifal to speak in front of the battle. The latter naturally agreed happily. After all, such achievements as the recovery of the Holy City are not common. Bishop Manifal was very eloquent and could speak for 2 hours, enough time for the defenders to block the road with stones and trees. This is the Orthodox Alliance soldier who is watching the enemy blocking the road. After walking on the mountain road for a long time, Bishop Manifal was already thirsty. After talking for such a long time, he had to ask the attendant to bring him a glass of honey water and drink it in one gulp. Soldiers, I know that you are afraid and scared. This is human nature. So His Majesty the Pope has specially prepared this for you. At this time, Bishop Manifal asked his Jesuit priests to carry several heavy boxes, which even stirred up dust. When they landed on the ground. The soldiers in the audience began to whisper, His Majesty the Pope actually prepared a reward for us. Long live His Majesty the Pope. Several Orthodox Alliance officials also felt that the Papal State was still the most powerful, and the surrounding countries did not send aid. It seemed that only God could be trusted. In fact, all the aid was sent to the enemy, but they didn't know it yet. Also, guess what's in the box? Chapter 793, shifting from strategic offense to strategic defense. However, as the boxes were opened one after another, everyone was dumbfounded. What was inside was neither gold, silver, jewelry, nor any big weapons, but stacks of yellowed indulgences. Soldiers, this is an indulgence personally consecrated by the Pope. As long as you hold this, no matter how many crimes you commit, you can ascend to heaven without any hindrance. What are you waiting for? Go! Shouted Bishop Manifal. The morale of the Orthodox Alliance soldiers was plummeting. After all, everyone thought it would be something more practical. Now the reward is gone, and morale is gone. Pius IX actually really wanted to support the Orthodox Alliance in Switzerland, but the Papal State had no money and already owed hundreds of millions of francs to the French bank. Not to mention the principal, even the interest had to be borrowed from Austria. So the Pope could only send his strongest generals and loyal Jesuits to help, but it seemed a bit shabby to be left empty-handed. At this time, Palmer Monsi, Pius IX's most trusted Secretary of State, suggested, is it possible to send the unsold indulgences in the Holy City to Switzerland? This would allow the Orthodox Alliance to express gratitude to the Holy See for its grace, and also digest the inventory. After all, warehouses also cost money. Moreover, this Swiss civil war is equivalent to promoting our indulgences. As long as we can build a reputation, orders from various countries will fly in like snowflakes. Are we still afraid that we will not be able to recoup the cost? So I think the investment is worth it. The Secretary of State's words struck a chord in King Pius IX's heart, making the latter very satisfied. However, Pius IX just nodded, because he believed that speaking less could increase the mystery and make it easier to rule. Point back on the battlefield north of Fribourg, the soldiers of the Orthodox Alliance were reluctantly driven into the narrow mountain pass. The soldiers of the other side's Free Alliance were equally reluctant. The strength of the other side's troops was not known to be dozens or hundreds of times that of our own. They joined the army just to have a better life, not to die here. Mads Dickinson is the captain company commander responsible for garrisoning this fortress. In fact, he originally only had more than 50 people under his command, who were just hanging around every day. However, the Swiss Confederation's conscription law is really easy to use. In preparation for war, his company was immediately expanded to 500 people. But he knew everything here very well. As a veteran, Yowzi knew what the soldiers were thinking. If he really fights to the end, he is afraid that his group of big-headed soldiers will push him off the cliff before the enemy attacks. But having said that, the fortress itself is very strong and built against the mountains, and there is only a narrow mountain road in front of it that is very steep. There are hundreds of people guarding here, not to mention tens of thousands, even millions of people cannot attack it. Captain. The enemy is coming. The captain of the sentry ran in panic. What's there to panic about? Can they fly up? The many rocks and wood just thrown are enough for them to move for a while. Mads Dickinson said impatiently that if the young man in front of him was not his sister's biological son, he would not bother to care about it. Uncle, didn't you say you were going to run away last night? The sentry captain asked cautiously. What nonsense are you talking about? We Swiss people have always been the most honest people. How can we escape casually, since we have accepted the employment? And the military pay given by General Dufour is quite a lot. Listening to his uncle's righteous words, the sentry captain was a little confused and thought to himself, why is it different from what was promised? The people around were also a little confused. They didn't know what illness the company commander had. There were at least tens of thousands of people under the dark mountain. They are not afraid of bullets while hiding in the fortress. But what if the opponent uses cannons? The artillery fired directly at close range, and the scene of blood and flesh flying after the shotgun shells, solid bullets, and explosive shells hit the human body was played out repeatedly in their minds. Just when they were wondering whether to push the stubborn company commander off the cliff to cause an accident, Mads Dickinson said, "We must at least fire a few shots to be worthy of General Dufour." "Yes, Your Excellency, Captain." Everyone let out a sigh of relief. In fact, Captain Mads Dickinson had his own plans. The spirit of the contract was important, but his own life was more important. However, it is still necessary to put in 2 casual shots. If the Orthodox Alliance wins, they say that they do not want brothers to kill each other for the sake of the peace of the Federation, so they abandoned the fortress. If the Free Alliance wins, they can also say that the enemy's offensive is too fierce. They had to retreat when they ran out of ammunition and food. However, the reality is that one shot can destroy hundreds of meters, making it invincible. The Valley Fortress was at least a few hundred meters away from the Orthodox Alliance army, but as soon as the gunfire rang out, dead bodies were strewn all over the road hundreds of meters along the Valley Mountain Road. Even if someone didn't fall down immediately, everyone would fall to the ground. After looking around for a while, the Cheyenne Tang Alliance soldiers in the back watched for a while and rushed down the mountain road with shouts, "It's witchcraft. The people of the Freedom Alliance have sold their souls to the devil. Run away, Captain." Mads Dickinson looked at the rifle in his hand that was like a tactical nuclear weapon and was a little confused as to what to do. The surrounding soldiers and relatives didn't even know where to praise him because there were flaws everywhere. You may say that he is right, but this scene is a bit indescribable. In short, Captain Mads Dickinson repelled tens of thousands of troops from the Orthodox Alliance with a single shot. In fact, when the army first collapsed, Bishop Manaful actually planned to organize an exorcism ceremony, but unfortunately, the defeated soldiers fled too fast and did not give him a chance. One of the priests who failed to escape was even trampled to death and became the only victim of the battle. When Henry Dufour arrived and led the main force of the Swiss Free League, He did not find corpses strewn across the field and a smoke-filled battlefield, but mountains of stones and logs. The smart thing about Captain Mads Dickinson was that he did not choose to fight hard or give up escaping directly. Instead, he chose the most primitive way, to block the road with rocks and logs. People can climb over these obstacles, but it is very difficult to climb over these obstacles and fight the fortress defenders. After all, once you climb over, you may not be able to come back. That's why the Orthodox Alliance's army was shot to pieces dozens of meters away by Captain Mads Dickinson from a few hundred meters away. Although these temporarily recruited farmers and unemployed workers were not highly educated, they were not stupid either. They could still distinguish between those who might die in battle and those who would definitely die in battle. Moreover, the indulgences of Bishop Maneful and Pius IX were really weak, so the Orthodox Alliance army collapsed as soon as the gunshots were fired. Historically, the Orthodox Alliance's army was not that strong, and they only suffered the bitter consequences of defeat when 2 people were killed. These obstacles are a trouble for the Orthodox Alliance army, and they are also a big trouble for Doofur's Free Alliance army. So Doofur's main force had to carry out 3 days of obstacle clearance work before the army could pass. Chapter 794 Reinforcement. Fribourg Fortress, Canton of Fribourg. In fact, Bishop Maneful did not command at the front line, but had been sitting in the center. Therefore, he didn't know exactly what was going on ahead. He only knew that the 50,000 strong army that had set out for the expedition had only 40,000 left at this time. After that, he tried several times to break out from other directions, but the results were similar. However, after several disastrous defeats, the troops recovered, and Bishop Maneful's confidence was restored a lot. At this time, he began to review his mistakes, but he did not expect that the enemy's Achilles heel was also himself. But he did not lose. As long as he defended the Tanagachi fortress, he would be invincible. On the other side of the battle, Lucerne. Constantin Sigfort, the state representative of the Orthodox Union, and Supreme Marshal Ulrich Salas were pacing back and forth in the room. They originally wanted to implement Bishop Maneful's retreat strategy. But at the beginning of the war, the situation was not optimistic. The 3 states of the Orthodox Alliance rebelled immediately. Before that, they had defrauded a large number of weapons and supplies. The rebellions in the 3 states of Argor, St. Gallen, and Ticino directly cut off the Orthodox Alliance's access to the outside world, and the main force of the Orthodox Alliance taken away by Bishop Maneful was trapped in Fribourg, making the situation one-sided tendency. The supreme military and political commanders of the Orthodox Alliance were like 2 ants on a hot pot at this time. Archduke Karol was still conscientiously arranging his troops. Constantin Sigfort asked, "Archduke, when will the Austrian reinforcement arrive?" This was a very spineless question, which made the adjutants around Archduke Karol despise him even more. Archduke Karol has 3 lieutenants, one of whom is the family's captain of the guard, Sigismund, who is in his 50s and a veteran of the anti-French war. There are 2 left. Among them, the guy with blonde hair, blue eyes, tall figure, and a big beard, who wants to have the word German noble carved on his forehead, is called Heinrich Behm, who is the 43rd Theresa military officer, a top student in the academy. He was given the position of colonel just after leaving school, which shows that the empire has high expectations for him. Another rough-skinned, dark-skinned, and short officer named Tanner Armhold was not a regular officer, but was generally a wild man. He represents the mercenaries under Franz, but he is also a strong man who chooses the best, otherwise he would not be able to get the approval of Archduke Karol to stay by his side. "We are the reinforcement, Archduke." Karol finally spoke, but it disappointed Constantin Sigfort and Ulrich Salas. "Are you kidding me? Is it just them? There are also my guards, temporarily recruited veterans, and mercenaries, a total of 5,314 people." "Archduke," Karol answered seriously, 5,000 people. "But the Freedom Alliance has 130,000 troops, don't you still have 100,000 troops?" "But," Ulrich Salas said with some embarrassment, "our main force has been surrounded by the Free Alliance army in Fribourg. Now we can only rely on ourselves, and Argor, St. Gallen, Titus the rebellion and the 3 Chernau states cut us off from the outside world. What are you going to do?" "Hold on and wait for help, Archduke." Carol asked. Constantin Sigwart and Ulrich Salas looked at each other and nodded. Still. Waiting for help? Waiting to die? Heinrich Beam finally couldn't stand it anymore. He didn't know how such a person became the commander-in-chief. Seeing the destruction of friendly forces, wouldn't it be his turn next? What do you think we should do? Archduke Carol asked. Report. I think our army should attack the canton of Bern with all its strength, force Dufa's main force to return for reinforcement, and then cooperate internally and externally to annihilate them on the wide plain outside Bern. This can try to avoid the inability to deploy troops due to fighting in narrow mountainous areas. What about the 3 rebellious states and other free states? Ulrich Salas asked. He also wanted to do the same, but the problem was that there were enemies everywhere, and once they left, there would be no way out. As long as we can annihilate Dufa's main force, these are not problems at all, Heinrich Beam said confidently. In theory, this is indeed possible, but Dufa just can't stick to it, or Bishop Manifold's troops refuse to support. Then those who were annihilated were not the Free Alliance's troops, and the most important point is that the troops of the Orthodox Alliance are all new recruits, and their morale is extremely low, and they cannot afford the huge cost of siege. Generally speaking, this tactic is suitable for use when the strength and quality of the soldiers are superior, but now is obviously not the time. Archduke Carol did not say anything, but named Taner Ahmed, a commander with a mercenary background. Your Majesty the Grand Duke, I feel very honored. However, I cannot agree with Major Irabum's opinion. I think our troops are too small, and it would be a drop in the bucket to support Bishop Manifold now. It would be better to attack weakly defended states such as Argor, Zurich, and Lagros first. This would not only open up channels to the outside world, but also spread the flames of the Free Alliance, forcing Dufa to return to defense. As long as Freiburg can delay for a month or two, the Free Alliance will automatically collapse. Archduke Carol nodded and shook his head. This approach is indeed feasible, but it is not a war of honor. This is different from what Franz and himself want. The result may be that Austria will be stigmatized for killing innocent people, and the original goal will not be achieved. So his trip will be in vain. Archduke Carol knew very well that this was his last battle, because he was already old and a little behind the times. In fact, Franz also said another thing, that is, Freiburg might not be able to last even a week. The most fundamental problem is that the new soldiers temporarily recruited by the Orthodox Alliance cannot fight a siege at all. If Freiburg really can't hold on for even a week, then the troops going to attack Argo will be blocked under the city and attacked from both sides. The result is of course needless to say. Just then a French officer broke in. This young man was wearing a French colonel's uniform. As soon as he entered the door, he raised his hands to show that he meant no harm. But the 2 guards tied him up anyway. I am Franz, commander of the 19th Line Infantry Regiment, Charles Duchet. I have been ordered to help you. The French, weren't they all sent back home by the members of the Freedom Alliance? They also sent a batch of weapons to each other. Heinrich Beam asked with a little doubt and a little sarcasm. The Swiss have a very messy accent, so someone speaking German didn't attract Charles much attention. My men and I put on civilian clothes, hid our weapons in the firewood truck and sneaked in. I'm here to help you on behalf of France. I have no ill intentions. I also have a personal letter from His Majesty on me. After a brief identification, Archduke Carol believed the other party's words and also thought of a good idea to shift the blame. Colonel Charles Duchet, I hope you can lead the French warriors to capture Ticino and open a lifeline for us. Chapter 795 Arrangement of Troops. Ticino claims to have tens of thousands of troops, but they did not occupy the important Gotthard Pass in advance. It seems that either the troops are insufficient, or the commander is arrogant and stupid. In short, there is a high probability that this will be an unequal battle for both sides. In fact, according to Austrian intelligence, the total strength of Ticino state is indeed tens of thousands as they said, but in fact these troops have not been mobilized. Where did this information come from? Naturally, he came from Ticino. In fact, Franz had already planted thousands of mercenaries and intelligence agents here. It was impossible for him to really put Archduke Carol in danger or die directly in Switzerland. Of course, Theoretically speaking, if Archduke Karol died in Switzerland, this would give Austria a good reason to send troops, but the consequences would be a huge negative impact, and it would also add a disgrace to the war. Generally speaking, the gains outweigh the losses. In fact, it's not just Ticino. Franz also deployed manpower in St. Gallen. It is not a problem for Austria to deploy manpower to these two regions. After all, the Germans and Italians themselves are the two largest groups in Austria. As for the identity of Charles Duchet, it is also easy to identify. Although Louis Philippe wrote few autograph letters and few people could identify his handwriting, Archduke Karl happened to be one of them. Other papers, pens, ink, stationery, and seals are also extremely difficult to copy, so Archduke Karol can conclude that the young man in front of him is the person personally appointed by Louis Philippe. Similarly, the identity of Archduke Karol is also easy to identify. Because the Austrian royal family also has many special items, which generally no one dares to imitate. And even if you want to imitate it, there is simply no way to do it. Ordinary people have no access to it. Those who have access to it have a high status, and will generally not cause trouble for themselves. Charles Duchet was very excited to see Archduke Karol. After all, the latter was a legend from the old times. "Hello, I'm Charles Duchet from Lyon. It is an honor to fight alongside you, Archduke." Karol nodded in response, and then he took out a map and handed it to Colonel Charles Duchet. "There may be nearly 10,000 defenders in Ticino, but according to the latest news, they still have not captured the Gotthard Pass. So as long as you act fast enough, you can seize this common transportation link between Valais and Ticino hub point. Then you can wait for the follow-up reinforcement to take Ticino state in one fell swoop, to open the way for the Orthodox alliance to connect with the Kingdom of Lombardy and Sardinia." The two sides had briefly exchanged intelligence before. Charles Duchet was not an incompetent person. He understood what it meant to regain Ticino state at this time point, but what made Charles Duchet even more emotional was that he was the only one of the dozen teams to arrive in Lucerne on time, and the number of people on the Austrian side was obviously much greater than his own. The so-called Swiss Orthodox Union is worse than I imagined. They are probably not even a militia, and the commander is so stupid that he would choose to throw himself into the trap. Fortunately, the valley entrance terrain of Freiburg is also very unfavorable to the attacker. As long as there are no accidents, it is not a problem for the Orthodox Alliance's army to defend Freiburg for several months. But this war should not have been so passive. But this suited Charles Duchet, because he came here to make a name for himself. He wanted to become famous in one battle like Napoleon did in Towlin Point. So Charles Duchet made a surprising decision. "I don't need reinforcement. Just let them hold the St. Gida Pass. The second wave of the Freedom Alliance's offensive will definitely focus on attacking here." "How arrogant. Do you know how many defenders there are in Ticino, Heinrich?" Irabam roared angrily. He was a top student at this military academy, and the French boy in front of him actually rejected Archduke Karol's kindness and actually used 1,000 men to attack 10,000 in order to show off. The garrisoned province made him even more furious. Archduke Karol's idea was to detach 5,000 Walden troops, plus 5,000 Valais reinforcement, to cooperate with Charles Duchet's 1,000 French troops. Letting a colonel command an army of 10,000 men was already a sign of high regard for Charles Duchet, but the latter seemed dissatisfied, and was so arrogant that he wanted to use 1/10 of his troops to fight the Swiss. However, what surprised Heinrich Irabam even more was that Archduke Karol actually agreed. Instead of being angry, he asked with concern, "What about the supplies?" "No need. Our French army has always been defeated by the enemy because of food, and I don't have the troops to protect your baggage troops, but I need the Congreve rockets in your warehouse, as well as enough explosives and rope." "Marshal Ulrich, I hope you will meet Colonel Duchet's request." Ulrich Salas nodded and said, "Come this way, Colonel Duchet." "Thank you, Grand Duke." Charles Duchet took off his hat and saluted again. "Young man, you look very much like someone I know. I hope you can come back alive and tell your legend to the world, Archduke." Karol's words immediately excited the young man, and Charles Duchet turned around and bowed deeply again. "Thank you, Your Majesty the Grand Duke, and I wish you greater success. But This sentence also deeply hurt some people. After the French colonel left, Heinrich Beam asked reluctantly, why should he compare with Napoleon, Archduke? Karl looked at the future general of the Austrian Empire with some helplessness and fell into deep contemplation. His incompetent son seemed to be doing well too. Mr. Heinrich, I now need you to lead the troops of Walden and Valais to guard the St. Gilles Pass to prevent the Free Alliance from cutting off our retreat. Yes. Heinrich Beam hesitated. I will ask Mr. Sigwalt to write a certificate for you, and I will send an officer from the Orthodox Alliance to accompany you. Yes. Heinrich Beam replied with a loud voice, because being able to lead tens of thousands of people in combat is definitely an honor for an officer. Mr. Amt, I hope you can take your people to carry out a raid between the cantons of Argor and Zurich. You don't need to fight too much. You only need to target the enemy's granaries and arsenals. If you encounter the enemy's main force, please avoid it as soon as possible. You can go to other states for harassment. How to do it specifically, I think you know better than me. No problem, His Excellency the Grand Duke. This is our old profession. Just wait for the smoke of the Freedom Alliance to rise. Tanner. Armhold took off his hat and said respectfully, I'm waiting for your good news. Thank you for your trust. I won't let you down. Tanner. Armhold bowed respectfully and exited the room. At this time, Archduke Karol looked at his old guard captain, Sigismund. It's our turn now. Yes, everything is ready, Your Excellency. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 796, The Fall of Fribourg. The decisive battlefield in Archduke Karol's mind has always been Lucerne. First of all, it is the core of the Orthodox Alliance. Secondly, except for Zug, other states have natural obstacles, especially at the St. Gilles Pass in the south. Only a small number of troops are needed to completely seal the road. Although Heinrich Beam's personal ability is somewhat inferior, it shouldn't be a big problem, just because of his persistence. In fact, this is also a helpless move, because there is a real shortage of officers within the Swiss Confederation, especially the Orthodox Alliance. Fortunately, Colonel Charles Dutchet went to Ticino, otherwise Archduke Karol would have had to find a qualified officer to wipe out the rebels in this state. In the end, the Free Alliance's fastest way to end the war was to capture Lucerne. At the same time, Lucerne was also the most suitable area for large regiment operations. However, the preset battlefield that Archduke Karol came to was not a broad plain area, but a narrow mountain road. Constantin Sigvort and Ulrich Salas started a new round of conscription and food collection. There was no other way. The situation in Fribourg was unclear, and the rebellion in the three states directly stretched the forces of the Orthodox Alliance. Just as Justice Karol was arranging his troops, Duffer's main force moved, and the latter decided to launch a general attack on Fribourg. This doesn't seem like a very wise move. After all, Fribourg also has a strong fortress at the mouth of the valley. These fortresses cannot be easily captured by relying on large numbers of people, because the width of the entire mountain road is limited, and the number of troops that can participate in the attack is even more limited. Therefore, no matter how many troops there are, they cannot show their advantage. And when it really becomes impossible to hold on, as long as the road is blown up, it will take days to weeks for the other side to clear the obstacles. Bishop Manifal seemed very confident because of this. So he decided to go to the front line to command the defense in person. Before the war, the two sides routinely sent each other letters to persuade them to surrender. The contents were almost as follows: those who obey the heavens will prosper, and those who defy the heavens will perish. Now I have 1,000,000 soldiers and 1,000 generals. The prince can turn his back and take off his armor and surrender with courtesy without losing his position as a prince. Isn't it wonderful that the country is safe and the people are happy? However, Bishop Manifal's letter is quite unique. Dear General Duffer, I sincerely hope that you will consider my words carefully before making decisions that are foolish enough to cost the lives of your warriors. Your opponent is me, the #1 warrior under the Holy See, the invincible Manifal. As generals, you and I both know that war only brings pain, destruction and endless sorrow. If you can stop this wrong behavior, I assure you that we are willing to provide lenient conditions to protect your people and property and ensure their safety and dignity. As long as you recognize the right faith, we are still brothers. After Henry Duffer read the letter, he knew that it was the Pope who was causing trouble again, but Minifull was wrong. This was not the religious war that Pius IX thought. It was a war to unify 11 length units, 82 grain measurement units, 50 weight units, and more than 10 currencies. Although this is not a religious war, the Pope and the Papal States are definitely a very good target. We don't need a third country to intervene in our war. We are brothers. You were all deceived by the Pope's lackeys. The soldiers of the Free Alliance shouted repeatedly under the command of the officers. The soldiers of the Orthodox Alliance, who had no intention of fighting, began to hesitate, and even looked at the Jesuit priests. When Minifull saw this situation, he was afraid that there would be a mutiny here, so the Swiss kidnapped him and gave him to the Free Alliance. So he roared angrily, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" The Jesuit priest took the opportunity to grab the gunner's torch and lit the fuse, and a shell shot out. However, because he did not adjust the angle, it hit the positions in front of the two armies. However, this also became a signal for the two sides to start war. Duffer brought 64-pound cannons and 12 French-produced heavy cannons. The Jesuit priests in the fortress were able to fire several rounds before Duffer's artillery deployment was completed, but because the distance between the two sides was too far, the shell simply missed the target. Finally, after 3 rounds of firing from the Orthodox Alliance, the first round of artillery fire from the Free Alliance arrived. Intensive fire is naturally more powerful than sporadic artillery fire. With just 1 round of artillery fire, the Orthodox Union soldiers and Jesuit priests in the fortress began to flee in all directions, and even some officers joined the panicked crowd. Minifull patted the dust on his head and snatched the torch angrily. "Hurry up and reload. I'm going to fire." "But, Lord Bishop," the artilleryman on the side wiped his blackened face. "But, what? Are you a Protestant spy?" "No, no, no. But the barrel of the cannon is already very hot. If you hit it again, it will explode." "Nonsense. Just 3 shots and the chamber exploded. Hurry up and reload. Otherwise, I'll shoot you first." "Yes," the artilleryman replied quickly. 2 minutes later, a dull explosion sounded in the fortress. "Exploded? These guys are so stupid. Most likely their brains were damaged by chanting sutras." Augustine Keller, Duffer's adjutant, laughed. Duffer put down his telescope and clicked, but his face was sad, because the shelling of 72 cannons did not have much effect on this fortress, built on the mountain. However, after a few hours of shelling, General Duffer discovered a problem. That is, the fortress no longer fired back. Duffer, who didn't understand the reason, planned to send people to persuade him to surrender. After all, the cost of a strong attack was too high. Then he got the unexpected good news that the fortress was empty, and he had won the battle. Duffer decided to pursue the victory, and when he arrived at Fribourg, the city had already raised a white flag. It turned out that the previous bombing incident directly led to the death of Bishop Minifull, the supreme commander of Fribourg. As a result, the Jesuit priests fled in all directions, and the Valais troops who originally planned to support Fribourg also retreated to Valais. This battle resulted in a total of 41 casualties from the Orthodox Alliance and 3 casualties from the Free Alliance. The war was more brutal than the Battle of Chissaken, the most brutal battle in the Swiss Civil War in history. A total of 38 people on both sides were killed. Duffer ordered the disbandment of the Orthodox Union Army in Fribourg State. Although he did not continue to hold Fribourg State responsible, he also required them to bear military expenses and recruited labor to help the Free Alliance transport supplies. However, this result seemed very generous to the members of the Fribourg canton. As a result, in the Swiss Civil War, the Free Alliance took the first victory. Henry Duffer and Augustin Keller did not stay, but arrived in the Argau canton as soon as possible. Their plan was to divide their forces and send a small number of troops to attack Zug State, and then take the opportunity to lead the main force to attack Lucerne State. Because the terrain of Zug State is open, the Free Alliance army has an absolute advantage over the Orthodox Alliance at this time. 130,000 versus 40,000. In the eyes of the top leaders of the Freedom Alliance, there was no possibility of losing this war. They all dreamed of ending the war within 2 weeks, because they had already eliminated the opponent 4 days before the war began. More than half of the troops this war was outrageous in history. The entire war lasted only 27 days. The Swiss Federal Army had 78 killed and 260 wounded. The Orthodox Union Army had 26 killed and 114 wounded. Chapter 797. The country with the second fastest economic growth in Europe. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Point: it is not unusual for Prime Minister Metternich to appear here, but it seems a bit strange at this time point, because there are obviously more important things for Austria at this time, such as the war in Switzerland and domestic nationalism issues. But in fact, the purpose of Prince Metternich's trip was precisely for this purpose. Franz was no longer completely reclusive at this time, and the latter began to frequent the Regency Council and Imperial government agencies after the two met. They exchanged simple greetings for a while before Prince Metternich got straight to the point. Archduke Franz, I don't think our meeting should be postponed until April. The Russians and the British are too far apart. As long as we reach an agreement with France and the Kingdom of Sardinia to divide Switzerland, it won't be a problem. Point: the princes of the German Confederation were either too far away and powerless, or they were not enterprising and just wanted to reap the benefits. It's good to have strength in numbers, but these guys who are holding us back are really embarrassing and useless. Franz understood what Prince Metternich meant. You are saying that we can put aside the German Confederation and Britain and Russia, and then sign a tripartite agreement or some secret treaty with France and the Kingdom of Sardinia. Secret agreements between countries in this era were not uncommon. Almost every country had secret agreements with several countries at the same time. Point: for example, the Austrian side could gain control of Krakow before. This was the result of the secret agreement between Austria, Prussia, and Russia in 1835. Point: in fact, Austria still had many secret agreements at this time, such as to prevent France from making a comeback, to prevent the merger of France and Spain, to prevent France from annexing the provinces of the Kingdom of Sardinia, to prevent France from attacking Tunisia, to prevent France from annexing Belgium, and to prevent the Kingdom of Sardinia from annexing Monaco, preventing France's colonies on the east coast of North America from being connected to the Alaska concession, etc. Point: Monaco is surrounded on 3 sides by the Kingdom of Sardinia, and its population is less than 1% of the Kingdom of Sardinia, but Carlo Alberto cannot eat it. Yes, Your Highness. This is beneficial to all 3 of our countries, and only in this way can we join this war as quickly as possible before the Freedom Alliance wins. By this time, news of the Swiss Civil War had reached Vienna. Metternich never expected such a rapid and tragic defeat. Point: however, he felt that he had underestimated Franz, a young man. Because Franz had been trying his best to prevent Metternich from sending weapons, supplies, and military pay to Ticino state. Point: at this time, the canton of Ticino happened to rebel. It seemed that it was just Franz's momentary willfulness that sent the supplies that were supposed to support Switzerland to Galicia. Point: but Metternich knew very well how low the probability of this happening was, and the Austrian Empire was not short of money at this time, or the treasury had never been so rich, so it would not be a problem to spend a separate amount of money to support Galicia. Point: the reason why Franz tried his best to stop it was either because of the so-called prophecy, or because he had already learned the news in advance and did not want more people to know. Point: Metternich believed it was the latter, so he felt it necessary to discuss his thoughts with Franz. After all, the latter would be the Emperor of Austria in the future. Prime Minister, why do you think you established the Vienna system in the first place? Switzerland is the buffer zone between us and France, and now we want to destroy it with our own hands. Metternich was a little surprised, but it was only for a moment. The old Prime Minister's expression management was still in place. The Austrian Empire is no longer what it used to be. We have reached balance of payments since 1836. This is the best era for the Austrian Empire's economy since 1780 after the death of Empress Issa. Point: from 1834 to the present, our country's fiscal revenue has increased from less than 100 million florins to nearly 700 million florins now. The average annual growth rate is 17.65%, second only to Luxembourg, which regained its homeland. Point: Franz was actually a little helpless. At this time, the economy of the Austrian Empire was not growing completely naturally. In addition to the dividends from technology, colonies, policies, and the customs union, there was also the boost of gold mines that led to the economic miracle today. Rapid economic growth has brought about earth-shaking changes, and at the same time, the top leaders of the Austrian Empire have begun to have some unrealistic ideas, but we have only just surpassed France, and are still far behind the United Kingdom. And we do not yet have a fleet that can protect our overseas interests. If you think about the conflict between us and France, which country benefits the most? U.K. So, who is starting the Swiss Civil War? British, that's right. Doesn't Britain know that Joseph Lowe and his men can't defeat us? This, Metternich said after hesitating for a while, but now the Orthodox alliance has fallen into an absolute disadvantage. So, what? Switzerland's resources are scarce, there is not enough arable land, and the population is not large. This country cannot sustain a long-term war. What's more, I feel that the war has just begun. Canton, Argor, Switzerland. Duffer was angry at the incompetence of the defenders of Argor, Zurich, and Thurgau, and actually let the other side burn almost all the arsenals, and several granaries were also burned. However, he knew that, although a lot of the granary was burned, there was definitely still food. Because these governors do not have the lion's mouth wide open is the best proof. Furthermore, it is not certain whether those granaries were burned by the Orthodox Alliance army or by themselves. Duffer didn't want to delve into this, so he could leave the overly brutal General Freddy Halosa here to deal with the small forces of the Orthodox Alliance. After all, General Freddy Halosa is a rare strong-armed general in Switzerland. If he appears on the front line, he will be a huge threat to both the enemy and ourselves. In fact, Duffer still hoped to fight a perfect war at this time, especially after the previous victory in Fribourg. The remaining Orthodox Alliance states, except Valais, are all gathered around Lucerne. With a perfect surprise attack, he can win a complete victory. However, the risk of directly attacking Lucerne was still too high, so Duffer decided to order Augustin Keller to lead a force of 50,000 people to attack Zug. The canton of Zug is on the periphery of the Orthodox Alliance and is undefinitionable. The most important thing is that Joseph Lowe claims to have bribed the top leaders of the canton of Zug and can solve the problem without bloodshed. Duffer sent another force to attack Lucerne from the front. Although the frontal battlefield is very lively, his real trump card is to advance quickly on a mountain path. The early morning sun shines through the rugged rocks in the valley, and a Free Alliance army is walking swiftly on the mountain road. Only these mountain people can fly on the mountain roads without any delay. In fact, there are more than a dozen mountain roads leading to Lucerne. However, these paths are too narrow and only a limited number of troops can pass through them, so generally speaking, commanders will not be so picky. Although the number of troops that could pass through was limited, Duffer saw the fact from the previous Battle of Fribourg that the Orthodox Alliance army had a serious lack of fighting spirit, and its morale was so low that it could escape at any time as soon as a gun was fired. Chapter 798, The Bloody First Day. However, it is unlikely that the situation like the previous situation where the enemy commander played with his own cannon and exploded himself to death will happen again. However, it is still very feasible to use a surprise force to attack from both sides or to rush directly into the city of Lucerne to capture Constantine Sigwalt alive. Unfortunately, his vanguard of surprise troops only knew how to rush on their way and did not discover the small Austrian army hidden in the valley. The small vanguard of the Freedom Alliance even lit a bonfire, which actually sent a signal to the rear that it was safe here. The smoke that rises is similar to the smoke from the fires of ordinary hunters and shepherds, only they can distinguish it. On the cliff, groups of Austrian soldiers were lined up in a row, heading towards the designated area with a long rope tied around their waists. Duffer's main force responsible for the surprise attack, led by Colonel Korbel, did not have much preparation. After all, the previous battle was too smooth, and the previous vanguard also sent a signal of safety. Colonel Korbel feels that he will become a hero because he will catch the traitor Constantine Sigwart, and then he will become a real colonel. At this time, he was still a lieutenant, but was temporarily promoted to colonel. However, General Duffer did not allow the looting, which in the eyes of Colonel Corbel was an insult to the war after all. Many people joined the army just to make money, and the most profitable thing about joining the army is war, and the reason why war is profitable is because it allows looting. Colonel Corbel has already thought about it. He can go to the capital of Lucerne to plunder first. If Constantine Sigwart knows how to bribe him with money, then Colonel Corbel can think about it carefully. At this moment, a gunshot broke the tranquility of the valley, and the orderly soldier next to Colonel Corbel fell down at the sound. The battle broke out, and many Swiss soldiers were killed before they could load their rifles with gunpowder. In fact, in the panic, more soldiers forgot to charge their muskets and just held the guns and pulled the triggers crazily, making the sound of biu-biu in their mouths. The attackers' gunshots came one after another, which made Colonel Corbel feel that he must have encountered the main force of the Orthodox Alliance. A one-sided massacre was taking place in the valley. Colonel Corbel ordered a retreat. However, he was hit by a bullet and fell to the ground in disbelief as he covered his chest with a bullet. Before running a few steps, an officer with some gray hair put away his smoking rifle and handed it to the soldier next to him. There. Finished. Remember, you can only chase them one after another and don't engage the enemy head on. Yes, it can be seen that the soldiers around him respect this old officer very much. The enemy commander here has been killed and morale has collapsed. Sigismund will rush to the next battlefield and repeat the killing point. Although it is a bit shameless to hit an officer, it is very efficient to destroy the enemy's command system in this way. Sniper rifle? If this thing had been born decades earlier, maybe the anti-French war would have been much easier, Sigismund said to himself. But no matter how shameless it is to use a sniper rifle, he will do it. After all, he is not a knight, just the captain of the guard of Archduke Karol. Several surprise attack troops suffered the same fate one after another. The commander was killed after giving the order to retreat, and the remaining soldiers fled without a trace. After fighting for a whole day, nearly 8,000 people were lost. Duffer didn't even know how many people were ambushed in the valley. Not only that, the number of people killed is unknown, the number of enemies killed is unknown, and the number of people on our side who escaped is unknown. Duffer only knew that half of his most elite shepherd army was directly scrapped. The shepherds in the Swiss mountains often have to deal with wild wolves and bandits, and occasionally engage in some unprofitable business, so they are considered to be the most effective warriors. However, it was only one battle at this time. In less than a day, 8 regiments of shepherders were wiped out. Duffer immediately ordered the storming of the most important fortress outside Lucerne, the bridgehead on the Reuss River. This fortress was not protected by mountains, but it was a standard bastion. What's even more disadvantageous is that, if you want to attack this bastion, you must first pass the Reuss Bridge or cross the Reuss River. This section of the river is not too wide, but hiking across it in the winter is not a good idea. Then we can only attack head on and use our 130 cannons to clear the way. In fact, the main reason why Duffer stormed the bridgehead was that he felt that the commander of Lucerne must have deployed a large number of troops in the valley, so he could break up his own formation so quickly and effectively. However, reality gave him a blow. The defenders hiding in the bridgehead did not engage in an artillery battle with Duffer, but aimed their artillery at the soldiers preparing to cross the bridge. The soldiers on the bridge were crowded together like minced meat, and shells flew into the crowd and created bloody alleys. There were broken limbs and broken arms everywhere. Wailing sounds could be heard one after another, and the whole bridge was covered with flesh and blood. Looking at the hell-like scene in front of him, Duffer realized that he was actually at war. The fantastic start made him forget the cruelty of the war, and he even fantasized about doing what he did in Freiburg. After thinking about this, Duffer ordered the war team to rush more soldiers to the front line. The farmers who were digging in the fields more than 10 days ago couldn't help but tremble when they saw the bridge covered with fresh blood and flesh in front of them. The supervisory team had served as mercenaries and had extensive experience in fighting in all directions. The soldier on the far left fell to the sound of a gunshot. Superior. The recruits still couldn't stop shaking. There was another gunshot, and then a row of gunshots. Listen, those who retreat will die. Those who hesitate and do not move forward will die. Those who are afraid of the enemy and cowardly fight will die. Superior. Finally, some soldiers couldn't bear it anymore and rushed onto the slippery bridge with their guns in hand, but they soon fell down and did not know whether they were alive or dead. More recruits were then driven onto the bridge, and the brave soldiers used the corpses to create a path, but the bridge collapsed just before reaching the other side. The dead and the living fell into the icy Rias River together, which soon dyed the river red and finally merged into Lake Lucerne. Dufa beat his chest when he saw it, but he knew that this was the true nature of war. That's why he hated war so much. The Battle of the Rias River was one of the most brutal battles in the Swiss Civil War in the previous life, but this time the casualties on the Free Alliance side alone exceeded 2,500. Which was 100 times the number in history. Counting the Shepherd's Regiment lost in the Western Valley, Lucerne's First War Free Alliance suffered losses of more than 10,000 people. In fact, most of them were deserters, while the Orthodox Alliance lost less than 100 people, including 7 people lost their footing and fell into the valley while pursuing. They were tied together when walking on the cliff, but not tied together after the war started. Archduke Karol looked at the bloody battlefield through the telescope and did not show much emotion. On the contrary, Constantine Sigwart and Ulrich Salas looked very excited. What a miracle! If we continue to fight like this, our counterattack on Geneva will be just around the corner. Chapter 799. Let the boat row a little longer. However, they soon stopped laughing because the state of Zug actually surrendered. The top leaders of the Orthodox Alliance made a lot of efforts and spent a lot of resources to defend Zug's state, but the result was that they surrendered without a fight, which was a huge blow to morale. Another thing that hurt morale even more was that General Friholos of the Free Alliance claimed that the main force of the mercenaries of the Orthodox Alliance had been defeated by him, and the remaining members had basically surrendered. The entire Orthodox Union was once again at a huge disadvantage, and there were rumors that the remaining states were in private contact with the government of Joseph Loy. Seeing the bad news coming one after another, the two leaders of the Orthodox Alliance fell into despair, but they always looked at Archduke Karol from time to time, hoping to get an answer like Austria's. Reinforcement will be here soon, but all they got was a comfort. Don't worry, I'm here. This war will not be lost. Archduke Karol was more aware of the war situation at this time. He knew that the war had just begun, and the so-called Orthodox Alliance did not have a strong leader at all. If this continues, there is no need to fight at all. Just civil strife caused by distrust and fear can bring down the entire country. Therefore, the Orthodox Alliance still needs a big victory to stabilize its position. This is almost an impossible task for the Orthodox Alliance, which is at an absolute disadvantage in terms of military strength at this time. Fortunately, Dufa had already lost a lot of troops due to underestimating the enemy's advance, so he should consider bypassing Fort Roy again, or wait for reinforcement, before making plans. Archduke Karol planned to attack Augustin Keller's main force head-on in Schwyz state. According to intelligence from both the Orthodox Alliance and Austria, Augustin Keller's main force did not intend to garrison after conquering Zug state, but wanted to move along. Slow down. To be honest, Augustin Keller's military quality is much worse than Dufa. The former won the victory in Zug without spending a single soldier. In addition, the previous battle in Fribourg made him feel like fighting. That's about it. So Augustin Keller, a general with a background as a member of parliament, took it for granted and ordered his troops to move down the river, preparing to take advantage of the situation. To capture the canton of Schwyz, he directly ordered the seizure of all ships on Lake Zug, and then rushed directly to Schwyz. Regardless, at this time, there was a conflict between the Schwyz state government and the army. The army felt that it should fight Augustin Keller. Although its own troops were insufficient, it could push the opponent back into the lake, while the opponent's footing was not stable. But the state government thinks it can be negotiated. The worst case scenario is that it will surrender like the states of Fribourg and Zug. Just when the two sides were arguing, Archduke Karol came with the main force of the Orthodox Alliance. When Constantine Sigwart and Ulrich Salas saw that the enemies had landed, the Schwyz state fired back. Local officials were dismissed without notice. Several state legislators who planned to negotiate were directly thrown into prison. Just when everyone thought it was time for a big fight, Archduke Karol asked the soldiers to rest first and go to a decisive battle with Augustin Keller the next day. Why? Aren't we just sitting back and watching each other escape, Marshal? Ulrich Salis asked in confusion. Although he was not a military genius, he understood the principle of attacking halfway across the border. Prince Eugen used this method to severely damage Mustafa II's main force with only his vanguard, creating an exaggerated exchange ratio of 150. Now Augustin Keller was obviously careless. At this time, the main force of the Orthodox Alliance plus the local troops of Schwyz state numbered close to 40,000 people. As long as the opponent had not completely crossed the river, they could swarm them. Not to mention an exchange ratio of 1 to 50. As long as it is 1 to 2 or 1 to 3, it will be enough to go down in history forever. Archduke Karol naturally knew this, but the transportation capacity of the ships on Lake Zug was limited. They could only transport about 10,000 people a day, and 10,000 people really couldn't be called a great victory. Therefore, not only cannot we attack in advance, but we must also allow the opponent to move confidently and boldly. What you said makes sense, so I think you should send someone to deliver the surrender letter. Everyone exclaimed. Then wasn't our bloodshed in vain? No, it's not that you actually surrender, but that Augustin Keller thinks that Schwyz will surrender like Zug. Can they believe it? Archduke Karol was a little helpless. He began to miss his staff. At least he didn't have to teach him such things. How will you know if you don't try? But what if there are too many people crossing the river and we can't defeat them? An officer asked quietly. Archduke Karol held his forehead, and Ulrich Salis scolded at the sight. The battle hasn't started yet. How do you know you can't win? The officer muttered something under his breath again. The battle hasn't been fought yet. How do you know you can win it? You, Ulrich. Salis was so angry that, if there were any officers in other countries who dared to speak like this, they would have been charged by their superiors with confusing the morale of the military. It's just that the so-called Orthodox Alliance in Switzerland is just a loose organization composed of some cantons, and the so-called leadership corps is extremely weak. They are still thinking of negotiating with the Free Alliance to solve the problem. In the end, Archduke Karol had to intervene to smooth things over. The Lucerne army will take the lead in tomorrow's battle. You can wait and choose to join or surrender directly. Although the atmosphere became more awkward, the dispute finally subsided. Augustin Keller was very happy after receiving the surrender letter from the governor of Schwyz, and even directly ordered the troops to start carnival mode. Some adjutants thought the matter was very strange, but Augustin Keller didn't take it seriously. Have you ever been in a war? No. Then you know what the heck? We have 50,000 people, and the Schwyz region has more than 10,000 troops. We can gather 30,000 troops tomorrow. What will happen if they don't surrender? But other states in the Orthodox Alliance still have troops. What the heck? The main force led by General Dufour is still in the west. Do they dare to withdraw? And just look at these bastards from the Orthodox Alliance. They are not even as good as ruffians. They have no courage or guts at all, so they will surrender. This is God's blessing. The Federation doesn't want to shed too much blood, otherwise they will all die. Haha, cheer up. Find a girl, I'll invite you today. As soon as Augustin Keller's words came out, the whole place immediately became excited, and the officers joined the carnival army one after another. However, a small number of officers were still worried, and they urged the troops to cross the river overnight. The next morning, the sun rose as usual. Although it was a carnival, only a few officers could participate. Most of the soldiers worked all night under the supervision of some officers, and a simple military camp was set up. The soldiers who had been crossing the river all night were also exhausted physically and mentally, but at the urging of the sergeant, they went to get food first and eat before resting, which would make it easier to recover their strength. Augustin Keller stretched himself and walked to the river with the support of two temporary military prostitutes. He was covered in stinky sweat last night and was ready to take a good wash. Then they heard the drums beating and the camp bells ringing wildly. Chapter 850-1. The main force of the Orthodox Alliance has arrived. Fight. Fight. Don't be afraid. Our reinforcements are constantly coming. As long as we hold on, we will win. Augustin Keller orders. He climbed up the bell tower. The Orthodox Alliance troops coming in like a tide had surrounded the place. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. At the same time, he had a question. Why are there so many people from the other side? But now Augustine Keller can't care so much. He must now arrange defense point. As a result, he discovered a problem. That is, he only knew some of the senior officers, but not all of them by name. Point at this moment, a rocket flew past the side eaves of the bell tower, and brilliant firelight rose in the camp, accompanied by shooting steel balls and constant screams. It's Congreve rocket. Before he finished speaking, he heard more than one soldier shouting, "Bomb! Run!" in the camp. Point then there were more rockets and more screams. To be honest, Archduke Karol didn't want to fight like this, but the soldiers of the Orthodox Alliance couldn't even line up. Point, and he didn't expect that the other party could build a barracks overnight. Although it was very crude, if they shot at close range, the Orthodox Alliance would definitely suffer, so Archduke Karol decided that it would be better to carry out fire coverage. Although this primitive Congreve rocket is not suitable for killing queues and cannot cause damage to strong fortresses, it is most suitable for indiscriminate killing, especially for simple wooden structure. Point, a large number of Congreve rockets were launched into Augustine Keller's temporary camp. The buildings and supplies in the camp were immediately damaged, and the fire quickly spread. Point, the greater disaster lay in the confusion of command. Neither Augustine Keller nor any of his officers could command the army, let alone such a chaotic moment. Point, some people want to line up to fight, some want to put out the fire, and some people are fighting for ships to prepare to escape. The chaos is unparalleled. Point, in fact, Augustine Keller also had artillery and Congreve rockets, but it was impossible to expect the soldiers of this era to fight back independently when they were leaderless. Of course, there were brave officers who took the lead and rushed into the armory to rescue supplies, but a series of explosions caused by the uncontrollable fire quickly engulfed them all. Point, more than 30,000 people were trapped in this rural dock like ants on a hot pot. The few soldiers who rushed out directly became the targets of the Orthodox Alliance army. They had no time to do anything, not even to load their bullets and surrender. The Orthodox Alliance recruits all gained confidence after several rounds of shooting, and with the frontline commanders forward, the recruits were no longer afraid, but showed a bit of fanaticism, looking even more ferocious against the firelight. Point, flames and explosions broke out in Augustine Keller's camp, and the ships in the harbor became everyone's lifeline. Point, in order to catch it, everyone fought with each other and tried their best. In order to escape, they tried their best. Some ships capsized due to overloading. Point, at the same time, the Orthodox Alliance army had no intention of letting them go. The queue was constantly advancing, and occasionally a few solid projectiles fell into the lake, causing water columns to rise into the sky. "I'm Augustine Keller. Get me on board." As soon as Augustine Keller stepped forward, he was knocked to the ground by a punch. His consciousness was blurred. When his vision gradually became clear, the last ship had already sailed away from the shore. Point, only then did Augustine Keller recognize that the man who had just knocked him down was the officer last night. Point, at this time, his camp had been turned into ruins, the remaining soldiers were being killed, and the battle was completely one-sided. Point, in fact, there was not much difference in the numbers of the two sides before the war started. But at this time, the army, including himself, could no longer squeeze out any courage. Point, some people tried to swim to escape, but how can the lake in winter be so easy to endure? Most of those people could not swim more than a few dozen meters before getting cramps and sinking to the bottom of the lake. Point, Augustine Keller listened to the constant screams. He immediately decided to kneel to the ground and raised his hands above his head, and then kept repeating, "I surrender. I surrender," in German, French and Italian. "I surrender." Note: the three most popular languages in Switzerland are German, French and Italian. Point, the battle went on without any suspense. Nearly 20,000 of the 30,000 troops Augustine Keller brought across the lake were killed or missing, and 10,000 were prisoners of war. The casualties on our side were less than 500, and a considerable number of them were accidental injuries. However, no matter what, the battle loss ratio was 50-1, which is definitely a battle that can be recorded in history. Point, the vast majority of the dead died from fires and drowning. Not many people died in battle. Many of them wanted to surrender, but the recruits and junior officers of the Orthodox Alliance had no experience at all. They saw any living creature They all want to fire off 2 shots before leaving point. If Marshal Ulrich Sallust of the Orthodox Alliance had not arrived in time, I'm afraid that the number of casualties would have increased further. This battle directly convinced the top leaders of Swiss state. They witnessed the entire battle from a distance and did not even have a chance to appear on the stage point. Then when cleaning the battlefield, they had to dig out charred corpses from the rubble and lift those cold corpses from the river. Although they were not the ones who died, a chill lingered deep in their bones. Clearing the battlefield was necessary because failure to bury the bodies in time, even in winter, could lead to disasters such as the Plague Point. This battle greatly boosted the morale of the Lucerne state. To be honest, even they themselves couldn't believe that facing the same number of enemy troops, this battle was as easy as chopping melons and vegetables. In the first battle in Lucerne, Archduke Karol defeated Dofer's 60,000 troops with 4,000 men. The former's prestige reached an unprecedented height in the Orthodox Alliance point. In fact, there were less than 2,000 people in the team that defeated the Free Alliance Shepherd Legion in the Western Valley point. It just happens that they can be condescending every time and have a local advantage and military strength point. As for why the intelligence is so accurate, the answer is military observation. Hot air balloons and telescopes. Observers on the hot air balloon first detect the enemy and then guide their own ambush troops their point at the same time. The military quality and weapons and equipment of the two sides are incomparable. Archduke Karol's guards are all veterans who have received many years of military training. Although the weapons they use are not all the latest lever action rifles, the lowest they use is the Low's mini bullet lens rifle point. This rifle should be regarded as an improved version of the 1854 Lorenz, and its performance is stronger than in history. However, the development speed of Austrian rifles is too fast at this time, and this muzzle-loading gun can only be used as a cover. As for the artillery battle at the bridgehead, Archduke Karol felt that it was better not to have the Swiss, because those recruits did not know how to use artillery at all, and had almost no other effect, except adding chaos. Archduke Karol used 2 big victories to establish his absolute leadership position in the Orthodox Alliance, and at the same time to stabilize the rear. At least the people in Swiss state did not dare to have this idea anymore. Point. Good news also came from Ticino. Colonel Charles Dutchet successfully defeated the Ticino garrison, and the situation immediately became unfavorable to the Free Alliance. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.